My name is Serena, and I'm 34 years old. I've been working as a park ranger at Shenandoah National Park in Virginia for the past 8 years. And in all that time, I thought I'd seen everything these mountains had to offer. I've dealt with lost hikers, aggressive wildlife, search and rescue operations, and even the occasional paranormal claim from visitors who swore they saw something unexplainable in the woods. I always remained professional and skeptical about those supernatural reports, chalking them up to overactive imaginations or the tricks that shadows and fog can play on the mind in these ancient mountains. But after what happened to me on October 15th, 2019, I can never look at these woods the same way again. And I understand why so many people leave these mountains with stories they struggle to tell. It was a Tuesday night, and I was assigned to the evening patrol shift that covers the Old Rag Mountain area. This is one of our most popular hiking destinations during the day, but at night it becomes completely different. Quiet, isolated, and honestly a bit eerie even for someone like me who's spent countless nights alone in these woods. The shift was supposed to run from 6 p.m. to 2 a.m., covering the main trails and checking the parking areas for any vehicles that might indicate stranded hikers or people camping illegally. It's routine work that I've done hundreds of times, and I know every inch of those trails like the back of my hand. I can navigate them in complete darkness if I need to, and I've never had any serious incidents during night patrols. That evening started like any other. I checked in at the visitor center, reviewed the day's incident reports, and loaded my gear into the patrol vehicle. The weather was clear and cool, typical for mid-October in the Blue Ridge Mountains, with just a light breeze rustling through the trees that were showing their full autumn colors. I remember thinking it was going to be a peaceful night as I drove up to the Old Rag Mountain trailhead parking area around 9:30 p.m. There were no vehicles in the lot, which was normal for a weeknight in October. I parked my ranger vehicle and grabbed my standard equipment: flashlight, radio, first aid kit, and my logbook where I record patrol observations and any incidents. I started my patrol on foot at exactly 10 p.m., beginning with the ridge trail that leads up toward the rock scramble section of Old Rag. This trail is about 2.8 miles to the summit, and my plan was to hike up for about an hour, check the area around the rock scramble for any signs of camping or vandalism, and then return via the saddle trail to complete a loop back to the parking area. It's a route I've walked countless times, and even at night with just my flashlight, I can estimate my timing pretty accurately. The first part of the hike was completely normal. I saw some deer along the trail, heard the usual night sounds of owls and small animals moving through the underbrush, and noted a few spots where fallen branches would need to be cleared during the next day's shift. About 45 minutes into the hike, I reached the area where the trail starts to get rocky and steep, leading up to the famous rock scramble that makes Old Rag such a popular challenge hike. This is where my memory starts to get strange, and where everything I thought I knew about these mountains changed forever. I remember checking my watch and seeing that it was 10:47 p.m. I was making good time and feeling completely normal, maybe a little tired from the uphill climb, but nothing unusual. I stopped to drink some water and was getting ready to continue up toward the summit when I noticed something odd about the forest around me. The night sounds had stopped completely. No owls, no rustling leaves, no insects. Just total silence that felt heavy and unnatural. In 8 years of night patrols, I'd never experienced anything quite like it. Even on the calmest nights, there's always some ambient sound in the forest. But this was different, like someone had hit a mute button on the entire mountain. I stood there listening for maybe 30 seconds, trying to figure out what might cause such complete silence. That's when I started to hear something else. A low humming sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The humming was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't mechanical like a generator or aircraft, and it wasn't natural like wind through trees or water over rocks. It had an electronic quality to it, but deeper and more resonant, almost like it was vibrating through the ground itself. As I stood there trying to identify the source, I noticed that my radio was making crackling sounds, and my flashlight began to flicker. I tapped the radio and tried to call back to dispatch. But I couldn't get any signal, just static and what sounded like distant voices speaking in languages I couldn't understand. The humming sound grew louder, and I started to feel disoriented. The taste in my mouth changed to something metallic and sharp, like I'd been sucking on pennies. My hands began to tingle, and I noticed that the hair on my arms was standing up, almost like there was static electricity in the air. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly, and I could see my breath, even though it had been comfortably cool just minutes before. I decided that something was seriously wrong, either with the weather or with some kind of equipment malfunction, and I needed to get back to my vehicle immediately to call for backup. I turned around to head back down the trail, but that's where my memory becomes completely blank. The next thing I remember is waking up at 4:17 a.m. according to my watch, and I was lying on the ground in a completely different part of the park. I was on the Limberlost Trail, which is nearly 12 miles away from where I had been on Old Rag Mountain. There was no possible way I could have walked that distance in the time that had passed, especially not through dense forest with no trails connecting those areas. I was lying on the wooden boardwalk that runs through the Limberlost swamp area, and when I sat up, I realized that something was terribly wrong with my hands. Both of my palms had what looked like burn marks, not like burns from fire or heat, but strange circular patterns that were red and painful to touch. The burns were perfectly symmetrical on both hands, with small circular marks arranged in a pattern that didn't match anything I'd ever seen before. My radio was completely dead, not just out of battery, but physically damaged somehow. When I examined it later, the internal circuits looked like they had been melted, even though the outer casing was completely intact. My flashlight was also dead, and when I opened it up, I found that the batteries had somehow been drained completely, even though they had been fresh at the start of my shift. I managed to walk out to Skyline Drive and flag down an early morning commuter who called 911 for me. The next several hours were a blur of medical examinations, incident reports, and questions I couldn't answer. The burn marks on my hands were photographed and documented, but the Park Service doctor couldn't explain what might have caused them. They didn't match any known type of burn injury, and there was no explanation for how I had ended up 12 miles away from my last known location, with no memory of how I got there. The investigation that followed was thorough, but ultimately inconclusive. My supervisor, Maria Lavender, who had been with the National Park Service for over 20 years, told me she'd never seen anything like it in all her experience. The Park Service brought in specialists to examine my equipment, and they confirmed that the radio damage was unlike anything they'd encountered. The melted circuits suggested exposure to intense electromagnetic fields, but there were no known sources of such energy in that area of the park. Search teams combed both locations, Old Rag Mountain where I'd lost time, and Limberlost Trail where I'd been found, but discovered no unusual evidence or explanations for what had occurred. What troubled me most during the investigation was learning about the terrain between those two locations. To walk from Old Rag to Limberlost Trail would require crossing some of the most rugged and dangerous terrain in the entire park. There are steep ravines, dense thickets of mountain laurel that are nearly impossible to penetrate, and several areas where the forest is so thick that even experienced hikers with GPS units have gotten lost for days. The idea that I could have navigated that terrain unconsciously, in total darkness, without sustaining any injuries beyond the mysterious burns on my hands, was simply impossible. During my recovery time, I started researching similar incidents in the area. What I found was disturbing. There had been other reports over the years from both Park Service employees and visitors about strange phenomena in the Shenandoah Mountains. Most were dismissed or explained away, but the patterns were eerily similar. Missing time, electromagnetic interference, unexplained physical effects, and encounters with phenomena that defied rational explanation. I discovered that indigenous peoples had long considered certain areas of these mountains to be sacred or dangerous, places where the natural world intersected with something beyond human understanding. The burn scars on my hands healed over the next several weeks, but they left permanent marks that I carry with me to this day. The circular patterns never faded completely, and on certain days, particularly when the weather is changing or during periods of high electromagnetic activity like thunderstorms, they still tingle and ache. I've had them examined by dermatologists and other medical specialists, but no one has ever been able to explain their origin or why they continue to react to environmental changes years later. The official incident report lists it as a medical emergency, with possible seizure activity causing memory loss. But I know that's not what happened. I've never had any medical conditions that would cause seizures or blackouts, and all of my medical tests came back completely normal. The explanation was created to file the paperwork and close the case, not because it accurately described what had occurred. I understand why the Park Service needed an official explanation. They can't have reports of supernatural incidents affecting their employees. But the truth is far stranger and more unsettling than what's written in that file. I continued working as a park ranger for 2 more years after that incident. But I never felt completely comfortable on night patrols again. I would find myself constantly checking my watch and radio, and I avoided the old Rag Mountain area whenever possible. The work I had once loved began to feel different, tainted by the knowledge that something inexplicable was lurking in these mountains. I eventually transferred to a different park in a different state, partly because I needed a change of scenery, and partly because I couldn't shake the feeling that something in those mountains was still watching and waiting. I've never experienced anything like that, night again, but I know that somewhere in the Shenandoah Mountains, there are forces and phenomena that we don't understand. I was unlucky enough to encounter one of them during what should have been a routine patrol in familiar territory. The experience changed my fundamental understanding of reality and left me with questions that I know will never be answered. Sometimes, late at night, I still wake up with a taste of metal in my mouth and the memory of that unnatural humming sound. And I'm grateful to be hundreds of miles away from those ancient, mysterious mountains that hold secrets we're not meant to discover. My name is Dylan, and I'm 28 years old. For the past 6 years, I've been working as a coal miner in Logan County, West Virginia, one of the most active coal mining regions in the state. It's hard work, dangerous work, and the kind of job that most people don't really understand unless they've done it themselves. We work long shifts, often in conditions that would terrify most people, hundreds of feet underground in tunnels that feel like they could collapse at any moment. But I grew up in these mountains, and coal mining is what my father did, and his father before him. It's honest work, and it pays well enough to support my family. What happened to me during my shift on March 23rd, 2021, though, has me questioning whether I want to keep doing this job, and whether there are things in these mountains that are far more dangerous than cave-ins or gas leaks. I work for Mountain State Mining Company, and our operation is located about 15 miles outside of Logan in an area that used to be deep forest before the company started surface mining there in 2018. Surface mining is different from the underground work that most people think of when they hear about coal mining. Instead of digging tunnels, we use massive equipment to strip away the topsoil and rock layers to expose the coal seams underneath. It's controversial because of the environmental impact. But it's also much safer than underground mining, and the pay is better. My job involves operating heavy machinery, bulldozers, excavators, and haul trucks to move the overburden and extract the coal. It's loud, dirty work, but I'm good at it. And I've never had any serious accidents or safety violations. That night in March, I was assigned to the midnight shift, which runs from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Night shifts at surface mining operations are usually quieter than day shifts because there's less management around and fewer pieces of equipment running simultaneously. My specific assignment was to operate one of the large excavators to continue removing overburden from a new section of the mine site. The area we were working on was right at the edge of the forest that borders our mining permit area. And during the day, you could see the tree line clearly about 200 yards away from where I was working. The contrast was always stark. On one side, you had this industrial moonscape of exposed rock and mining equipment. And on the other side, you had dense forest that looked like it hadn't been touched by humans in decades. I arrived at work around 10:30 p.m. to get briefed by the day shift supervisor and do my pre-operational equipment checks. Everything seemed normal. The weather was clear and cold, typical for late March in West Virginia. And there were 4 other guys working the night shift with me scattered around different areas of the mine site. We all carried radios to stay in communication, and there's a supervisor on duty at all times, though he usually stays in the office trailer, unless there's a problem. The excavator I was assigned to operate that night was a Caterpillar 365C. A massive machine that weighs about 65 tons can move incredible amounts of material in a single scoop. I'd been operating that particular machine for about 2 years, so I knew all its quirks and capabilities. I started working around 11:15 p.m., and for the first few hours, everything was routine. The work is methodical. You position the excavator, dig into the overburden, load the material into haul trucks, and repeat the process. It's almost meditative once you get into a rhythm, and I was making good progress on the section I'd been assigned. The area I was working on was particularly close to the tree line, maybe only 150 yards away. And I remember thinking that it was a shame to see more of that forest going to be cleared away as the mine expanded. These mountains have been here for millions of years, and there's something sad about watching them get torn apart, even if it is providing jobs for people like me. Around 2:30 a.m., I took a break to eat the sandwich my wife had packed for me and to stretch my legs. Working heavy equipment for hours at a time can be physically demanding, even though you're sitting down most of the time. The constant vibration and concentration required can wear you out. I climbed down from the excavator and walked over to where I had a clear view of the tree line while I ate. That's when I first noticed something odd. There was movement in the forest, but it wasn't the kind of movement you'd expect from deer or other wildlife. It was too big, too deliberate, and it seemed to be moving parallel to the tree line, like something was walking back and forth along the edge of the forest, watching our operation. At first, I thought it might be someone from the environmental groups that sometimes try to protest our mining operations, though it would be unusual for protesters to show up in the middle of the night. I grabbed my binoculars from the excavator cab and tried to get a better look. But the lighting at the mine site creates harsh shadows, and the forest beyond the reach of our floodlights was completely dark. I could see something moving, but I couldn't make out any details. The movement was rhythmic, like pacing, and it covered a distance of maybe 50 yards back and forth along the tree line. I watched for about 10 minutes, trying to decide whether I should radio the supervisor or investigate myself. I decided to get back to work and keep an eye on the situation. Mining operations sometimes attract curious people, and usually they lose interest and leave after a while. But as I continued working, I became increasingly aware that whatever was in the tree line was still there, and it seemed to be watching me specifically. Every time I looked in that direction, I could see movement, and I started to get the unsettling feeling that I was being observed. The sensation was so strong that it was affecting my concentration on the work, which is dangerous when you're operating heavy machinery. Around 4 a.m., I decided I needed to take another break and figure out what was going on. I parked the excavator and grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight, one of those tactical lights that's bright enough to illuminate objects hundreds of yards away. I walked to the edge of the work area, as close to the tree line as I could get while staying within the mine site boundaries. I aimed the flashlight toward where I'd been seeing the movement and turned it on full power. What I saw in that beam of light still gives me nightmares, and I know that no matter how many times I tell this story, people are going to think I'm crazy or making it up. Standing at the edge of the tree line, maybe 120 yards away from me, was something that looked like a man but wasn't human. It was enormous. I'd estimate at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller, and covered in dark hair or fur that seemed to absorb the light from my flashlight rather than reflect it. The body was massive and muscular, with arms that hung down almost to its knees and a chest that was broader than any human could possibly have. But what terrified me most was its face. Even at that distance, I could see that it had a face that was almost human, but wrong in every way. Too large, too angular, with eyes that reflected my flashlight beam like an animal's eyes do. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds, we stared at each other across that distance. I was frozen in place, not by choice, but because my body simply wouldn't respond to my brain's commands to run. The thing stood perfectly still, looking directly at me, and I had the overwhelming sensation that it was evaluating me, trying to decide what to do about the fact that I had seen it. Then, without any warning, it opened its mouth and let out a sound that I can only describe as the most terrifying scream I've ever heard in my life. The scream wasn't human, but it wasn't like any animal sound I'd ever heard either. It was deep and powerful enough that I could feel it in my chest, but it also had higher-pitched elements that seemed to cut right through my skull. The sound lasted maybe 5 seconds, and it was so loud that I'm sure it carried for miles through those mountains. As soon as the scream ended, the creature turned and disappeared into the forest with a speed that seemed impossible for something that large. I could hear branches breaking and leaves rustling as it moved away. But within seconds, the forest was completely quiet again. I stood there for several minutes, shaking and trying to process what I had just witnessed. My first instinct was to call the supervisor on my radio, but I realized that there was no way to explain what I had seen without sounding completely insane. Instead, I decided to continue working and think about whether I should report the incident. The rest of my shift passed without any further sightings, but I couldn't concentrate on my work. Every shadow in the tree line made me jumpy, and I kept expecting to hear that terrifying scream again. When the day shift arrived at 7 a.m., I was relieved to see other people and to know that I wouldn't be alone at the mine site anymore. I mentioned to a couple of the day shift guys that I had seen something unusual in the woods during the night, but I didn't go into detail about what it was. Most of them just assumed I had seen a bear or a large deer and didn't think much about it. I decided not to file an official report because I was worried about how it might affect my job, and because I honestly wasn't sure that anyone would believe me. But that afternoon, when I came back to work for my next shift, my supervisor, Rick Patterson, pulled me aside and asked me about what I had seen the night before. He said that the day shift crew had found something unusual near the tree line where I had been working. When he showed me the photographs they had taken, I felt sick to my stomach. There were footprints in the soft soil near the forest edge. Massive prints that were clearly not human, but also not like any animal tracks I had ever seen. The prints were at least 18 inches long and showed what looked like 5 toes, but they were much wider and deeper than human footprints would be, even from someone wearing boots. Rick told me that they had called in a wildlife biologist from the state to examine the prints, but the expert couldn't identify what kind of animal might have made them. The prints were too large for a bear, and the foot structure was wrong for any known species in West Virginia. The biologist took measurements and photographs, but he admitted that he had never seen anything like them in 20 years of studying wildlife in the Appalachian region. Rick asked me directly if I had seen what made those prints, and I told him the truth about my encounter with the creature in the tree line. To my surprise, Rick didn't seem skeptical about my story. He told me that there had been other reports over the years from miners and loggers in the area about encounters with something large and human-like in the forests around Logan County. Most of the reports were kept quiet because the companies didn't want to deal with the publicity or the potential impact on their operations. But Rick said that management was aware that there were unexplained phenomena in these mountains that occasionally affected their workers. The security cameras at the mine site had recorded the time when I used my flashlight to illuminate the tree line, and Rick showed me the footage. In the video, you can clearly see my flashlight beam, and you can see something large moving at the edge of the forest. But the resolution and lighting aren't good enough to make out any details about what it was. The audio from the security system had picked up the creature's scream, though. And when Rick played it back for me, it was just as terrifying as I remembered. The sound was so unusual that it didn't seem natural. It was like something from a horror movie. But I knew it was real because I had heard it myself. I continued working at the mine for several more months after that incident. But I was never completely comfortable on night shifts again. Every time I worked near the tree line, I found myself constantly looking toward the forest, expecting to see something watching me from the shadows. I started carrying a more powerful flashlight and made sure my radio was always working properly in case I needed to call for help. Several times, I thought I saw movement in the tree line, but I never had another clear sighting of the creature. Eventually, I decided to transfer to a different mining operation in a different part of the county, partly because the night shifts were affecting my sleep and my family life, and partly because I couldn't shake the feeling that something in those woods was still watching and waiting. I've never seen anything like that creature again, but I know it's still out there somewhere in the forests of Logan County. Other miners have reported similar encounters, and the stories are consistent enough that I believe there's something living in these mountains that science hasn't discovered or acknowledged yet. What bothers me most about the whole experience is the intelligence I saw in that creature's behavior. It wasn't just some wild animal that had wandered into the area. It was deliberately watching our operation, studying us, and it made a conscious decision to reveal itself to me when I shone my flashlight on it. The way it stood there and stared at me before screaming and disappearing suggested a level of intelligence and awareness that was deeply unsettling. I sometimes wonder if it was trying to warn me away from that area, or if it was simply letting me know that it was there and that it was watching us. I still work in coal mining, but now I'm on day shifts only, and I avoid working in areas that are close to dense forest. I've told my story to a few close friends and family members, but most people either don't believe me or think I saw a bear and let my imagination run wild. But I know what I saw that night in March 2021. And I know that there are things living in the mountains of West Virginia that are far stranger and more dangerous than anything most people can imagine. The Appalachian Mountains are ancient, and they hold secrets that we're probably not meant to discover. I was unlucky enough to encounter one of those secrets, and it's changed the way I look at these mountains forever. My name is Kayla, and I'm 42 years old. I've been working as a real estate agent in eastern Tennessee for the past 15 years, specializing in mountain properties and rural land sales. My job has taken me to some of the most remote and beautiful areas of the Cherokee National Forest. And I've hiked hundreds of miles of trails while scouting properties, evaluating land values, and showing clients potential investment opportunities. I know these mountains better than most people. I understand property boundaries, land surveys, historical records, and I'm familiar with every major trail system in the region. I'm not someone who gets lost easily, and I'm definitely not someone who imagines things or makes up stories for attention. But what happened to me on September 14th, 2018, has left me questioning everything I thought I knew about these mountains, and wondering if there are places in the Cherokee National Forest that exist outside of our normal understanding of reality. I was working on a potential listing for a client who owned 200 acres of forested land near the Ocoee River, about 12 miles south of Benton. The property had been in his family for 3 generations, but he was getting older and needed to sell it for retirement funds. My job was to hike the entire property, document any structures or improvements, take photographs for the listing, and assess the land's development potential. It's the kind of work I do regularly, and I usually enjoy these solo hiking trips through pristine forest areas. I'm comfortable being alone in the wilderness. I carry all the necessary safety equipment, and I always file detailed trip plans with my office so people know where I am and when to expect me back. I started my survey early that morning, around 7:30 a.m., beginning at the property's eastern boundary near Forest Service Road 221. The weather was perfect for hiking. Clear skies, comfortable temperature, and low humidity. According to the property survey I had with me, the land was mostly undeveloped forest with some old logging roads from the 1960s, but no permanent structures. The previous owner had mentioned that his grandfather might have built some hunting shelters somewhere on the property decades ago. But there were no records of any buildings, and he wasn't sure if they still existed or where they might be located. I spent the morning hiking the perimeter of the property, using my GPS unit to mark boundary corners and taking photographs of significant features like streams, rock formations, and old-growth trees that might add value to the listing. The forest was typical for that area, mixed hardwoods and pines, with dense understory in some areas and more open walking in others. I saw plenty of wildlife sign, including deer tracks and what looked like wild boar wallows, but nothing unusual or unexpected. By noon, I had covered about half of the property and was feeling confident that I would finish the survey by late afternoon, after eating lunch near a small creek that ran through the middle of the property. I decided to explore some of the old logging roads that showed up on the survey map. These roads were supposed to be overgrown and probably impassable, but they might still be useful for accessing different parts of the property, and potential buyers would want to know about them. I found the main logging road without much difficulty. It was grown over with saplings and brush, but the roadbed was still visible and walkable. I started following it deeper into the property, toward an area that the survey map showed as being the most remote and heavily forested section of the land. About 2 miles up the old logging road, I came around a bend and saw something that stopped me in my tracks. There, in a small clearing about 50 yards ahead of me, was a log cabin that looked like it had been built in the 1800s. It was a substantial structure, maybe 24 feet by 30 feet, with a stone chimney and a covered front porch. The logs were weathered, but appeared to be in remarkably good condition, and the roof looked like it was made of hand-split wooden shingles. There were 2 small windows with actual glass panes, and the front door was made of heavy wooden planks with iron hardware that looked hand-forged. My first reaction was excitement. Discovering a historical structure like this would significantly increase the property's value, and it would be a major selling point for potential buyers. But as I got closer to the cabin, I started to feel confused and then increasingly disturbed. The cabin was in far too good condition for something that had supposedly been abandoned in the forest for decades. There was no moss or mildew on the logs, no broken windows, no damage from weather or animals. The front porch had a wooden rocking chair that looked like it had been recently used, and there were what appeared to be fresh wildflowers in a mason jar sitting on the porch railing. I approached the cabin carefully, calling out to make sure no one was inside. There was no response, but when I looked through one of the windows, I could see that the interior was fully furnished with period-appropriate items. A wood-burning stove, handmade furniture, oil lamps, and even what looked like food supplies on shelves. Everything was clean and organized, as if someone was actively living there or had just stepped out temporarily. I tried the front door and found it unlocked, but I decided not to go inside without permission, since it was clear that someone was maintaining and possibly occupying the structure. I spent about 30 minutes walking around the cabin, taking detailed photographs from every angle and making notes about its construction and condition. I also used my GPS unit to mark the exact coordinates of the structure so I could find it again and bring the property owner back to see it. The GPS showed that the cabin was located at exactly 35.1847 degrees north, 84.4721 degrees west, which put it near the center of the property according to my survey map. I took over 40 photographs, including close-up shots of the construction details, the furnishings visible through the windows, and the surrounding forest area. When I got back to my office that afternoon, I immediately started researching the history of the property to find records of when the cabin might have been built and who might currently be living there. I checked county records, historical society archives, and even old aerial photographs from the 1950s and 1960s. But I couldn't find any mention of structures on that property. I also called the property owner to ask about the cabin, but he was adamant that there were no buildings on the land, and that his family had never built or maintained any permanent structures there. 3 days later, I returned to the property with the owner and a representative from the local historical society, planning to document the cabin more thoroughly and determine its historical significance. I led them directly to the GPS coordinates, where I had marked the cabin's location, following the same logging road I had used during my initial survey. But when we reached the coordinates, there was nothing there except dense forest. The clearing where the cabin had stood was gone, replaced by mature trees that looked like they had been growing there for decades. I was completely baffled. I checked and double-checked my GPS coordinates, thinking I might have made a mistake or gotten turned around. But the location was exactly where I had marked it. We spent over 2 hours searching the surrounding area, thinking the cabin might be nearby and I had simply recorded the wrong coordinates. But we found no trace of any structure. There was no clearing, no evidence of human activity, no disturbance in the forest floor that would indicate a building had ever been there. When I got home that evening, I immediately checked the photographs I had taken of the cabin, expecting to use them to prove to the others that the structure had existed. But when I opened the photo files on my computer, I was shocked to discover that every single photograph showed nothing but dense forest. The images were taken at the correct GPS coordinates and at the right times according to the timestamps. But instead of showing a log cabin, they showed the same thick woods that we had found when we returned to the site. I examined the photographs more closely, thinking there might be some technical problem with my camera or memory card. But the images were clear and properly exposed. You could see the exact spot where the cabin should have been, but there was nothing there except trees and undergrowth. The timestamps on the photos matched my notes about when I had taken them, and the GPS data embedded in the image files confirmed that they were taken at the correct location. But somehow, the cabin that I had seen and photographed had completely disappeared from the images. Over the next several weeks, I returned to the property multiple times, always going to the same GPS coordinates and searching the surrounding area thoroughly. I never found any trace of the cabin again, and I began to question my own memory and sanity. I had the property surveyed professionally, and the surveyors confirmed that there were no structures on the land and no evidence that any buildings had ever been constructed there. Soil tests showed no disturbance or chemical traces that would indicate human habitation. And aerial photographs going back to the 1940s showed continuous forest cover, with no clearings or structures. I started researching similar phenomena and discovered that there are documented cases of people encountering structures or landscapes that seem to exist temporarily before disappearing without a trace. These incidents are often dismissed as hallucinations or false memories, but the witnesses are usually rational, reliable people who have no reason to fabricate such stories. I found accounts from other parts of the Appalachian Mountains where hikers, surveyors, and outdoors professionals had encountered buildings, roads, or even entire settlements that vanished when they tried to return to them. The experience has had a profound impact on my work and my understanding of these mountains. I still work as a real estate agent, and I still hike regularly in the Cherokee National Forest. But I'm much more cautious about what I document and how I interpret what I see in remote areas. I've learned that there are aspects of these ancient mountains that don't conform to our normal understanding of physical reality, and that sometimes we encounter things that exist in ways we can't explain or comprehend. I've told this story to a few close friends and family members, but most people think I must have been confused about the location or that I dreamed the whole thing. The lack of photographic evidence makes it impossible to prove what I experienced. And I understand why people are skeptical. But I know what I saw that day in September 2018. And I know that for at least a few hours, there was a perfectly preserved 19th century cabin sitting in a forest clearing where no cabin should have existed. What disturbs me most about the experience is the implication that there might be places in these mountains where different time periods or realities intersect in ways we don't understand. The cabin I saw wasn't a ruin or an abandoned structure. It was actively maintained and appeared to be inhabited by someone from a different era. The furnishings, the construction techniques, even the wildflowers on the porch all suggested that I had somehow glimpsed a slice of life from the 1800s that was still continuing in some parallel version of that forest. I still have the GPS coordinates marked in my unit, and I sometimes drive out to the property just to walk to that spot and try to understand what happened there. The forest looks completely normal now, with no hint that anything unusual ever occurred there. But I can't shake the feeling that the cabin is still there somehow, existing in a different layer of reality that I was lucky or unlucky enough to glimpse for a few hours on that September afternoon. The experience has made me much more open to the possibility that the Appalachian Mountains contain mysteries that go beyond what we can measure and document with our modern technology. These mountains are incredibly ancient, and they've witnessed thousands of years of human history that we know very little about. Maybe sometimes, under the right conditions, we get brief glimpses of that hidden history, and maybe that's what happened to me when I discovered the cabin that wasn't there. My name is Dale Parsons, and I'm 67 years old. I've been hunting in the mountains of West Virginia for over 50 years, ever since my father first took me out into the Monongahela National Forest when I was just 15. In all those decades of wandering through these woods, I thought I knew every sound, every danger, and every trick that the wilderness could play on a man's mind. I've been lost in blizzards, faced down aggressive bears, and spent countless nights alone in the forest with nothing but my rifle and my wits to keep me safe. But what happened to me during deer season in November 2016 was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. And it's left me questioning whether there are things in these ancient mountains that prey on human emotions and memories in ways that no natural predator ever could. I had been planning this particular hunting trip for months. My regular hunting partner, my brother Jim, had passed away the previous spring after a long battle with cancer, and this was going to be my first solo hunting trip since his death. We had hunted together for over 40 years, and I wasn't sure I was ready to go back to our favorite spots without him. But my wife Margaret convinced me that it would be good for me to get back out there and continue doing something I loved. Jim would have wanted me to keep hunting, she said. And she was right. The hunting season had always been sacred time for us. A chance to disconnect from the world and spend time in the wilderness that had shaped both of our lives. I chose a section of the Monongahela National Forest that Jim and I had hunted many times over the years, an area about 20 miles east of Elkins that we called the Maple Hollow because of the dense stands of sugar maples that turned brilliant colors every fall. It's remote country, accessible only by a rough Forest Service road that requires four-wheel drive, and we had never encountered other hunters there despite decades of visiting the area. The terrain is challenging, steep ridges, deep hollows, and thick undergrowth that can hide deer until they're practically on top of you. But we knew the land well and had established several tree stands and ground blinds over the years. I arrived at our base camp on November 10th, 3 days into the rifle season, and set up my tent in the same clearing where Jim and I had camped countless times before. The weather was perfect for hunting, cold and clear, with just enough wind to mask small sounds, but not enough to make shooting difficult. I spent the afternoon checking our old tree stands and ground blinds, making sure they were still safe and properly positioned. Everything looked exactly as we had left it the previous year. And for a few hours, I almost felt like Jim was still with me, getting ready for another successful hunting season. The first 2 days of hunting were quiet but peaceful. I saw a few does and some young bucks, but nothing worth taking, and I was content just to be back. In the woods, reconnecting with a place that held so many good memories. I found myself talking to Jim sometimes, the way I always had when we hunted together, telling him about what I was seeing and asking his opinion about weather conditions or deer movement patterns. It felt natural and comforting, and it helped ease the loneliness of being in our special place without him. On the third morning, November 13th, I decided to hunt an area we called the Back Ridge, a narrow spine of high ground that overlooked a deep hollow where we had seen deer feeding in previous years. I left camp before dawn and hiked about 2 miles through familiar terrain to reach my chosen hunting spot. I had hunted from this location many times before, and I knew exactly where to position myself for the best view of the deer trails below. The morning was unusually quiet. No bird songs, no squirrel chatter, just the kind of deep forest silence that sometimes happens when weather systems are changing. Around 9:30 a.m., as I was sitting quietly in my ground blind watching for deer movement, I heard something that made my blood run cold. From somewhere deep in the hollow below me came the sound of a woman screaming for help. The scream was faint but clear, and it sounded desperate and terrified. My first instinct was to grab my rifle and head toward the sound. Someone was obviously in serious trouble, and I might be the only person close enough to help them, But as I started to move, something about the scream bothered me. It sounded familiar somehow, like a voice I had heard before, though I couldn't place where or when. I called out as loudly as I could, asking if someone needed help and telling them I was coming their way. The screaming stopped for a moment, and then I heard it again, this time seeming to come from a different direction, maybe a quarter-mile to the south of where I had first heard it. I grabbed my pack and rifle and started making my way down into the hollow, following what I thought was the most direct route to where the screams were coming from. The terrain was steep and treacherous, covered with fallen leaves that made footing uncertain, but I moved as quickly as I could while staying safe. As I got deeper into the hollow, the screaming continued, but it seemed to keep moving. Sometimes it sounded like it was coming from ahead of me, sometimes from behind, and sometimes from off to one side or the other. I would adjust my direction each time I heard it, but I never seemed to get any closer to the source. After about an hour of this, I was starting to feel confused and disoriented. I had been hiking in what I thought was a straight line toward the screams, but when I checked my compass, I realized I was heading in a completely different direction than I had intended. That's when I started to recognize something terrifying about the voice I was hearing. The more I listened to the screams, the more they sounded like my wife, Margaret. Not just similar to her voice, but exactly like her voice, with the same tone and inflection that I had been hearing for 43 years of marriage. The screams were calling my name now, pleading with me to hurry, to come and help her before it was too late. But Margaret was at home, 3 hours away, and there was no possible way she could be lost in these woods. I stopped walking and tried to think rationally about what was happening. I had been hiking for over an hour, following sounds that kept changing location, and I was no longer certain where I was in relation to my hunting blind or my base camp. I pulled out my GPS unit to check my location, but the device showed an error message and couldn't acquire a satellite signal, even though I was standing in an open area with a clear view of the sky. I tried my cell phone next, but there was no signal, which wasn't unusual in this remote area, but added to my growing sense of unease. The screaming started again, and this time I was absolutely certain it was Margaret's voice. She was calling my name, begging me to find her, saying she was hurt and scared and needed me to come quickly. Every instinct I had was telling me to run toward the sound, to find my wife and help her. But the rational part of my mind knew that it was impossible for her to be there. I stood frozen for several minutes, listening to what sounded like my wife's voice crying for help and fighting against the overwhelming urge to abandon logic and run blindly through the forest toward the sounds. Finally, I forced myself to ignore the screaming and focus on getting back to familiar terrain. I used my compass to establish a bearing toward what I thought was the direction of my hunting blind, and I started walking in that direction regardless of what I was hearing. The screaming continued, sometimes getting louder as if Margaret was getting closer, sometimes fading as if she was moving away from me. The voice pleaded with me not to leave her, accused me of abandoning her when she needed me most, and promised that she would die if I didn't come to help her immediately. It took every ounce of willpower I possessed to keep walking away from those sounds. But I knew that following them was only leading me deeper into confusion and danger. After about 40 minutes of steady hiking, I finally reached terrain that I recognized, and I was able to find my way back to my hunting blind. When I checked my GPS there, it worked perfectly and showed that I'd been walking in large circles for most of the morning, covering the same ground multiple times without realizing it. The screaming stopped as soon as I reached my blind, and the forest returned to its normal sounds: birds calling, squirrels chattering, and the wind moving through the trees. I sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of what had happened and whether I was losing my mind from grief over Jim's death and the stress of hunting alone for the first time in decades. But I knew what I had heard, and I knew that something in those woods had been deliberately trying to lead me astray by mimicking my wife's voice. When I got back to camp that afternoon, I called Margaret on my satellite phone to make sure she was safe. She was at home, exactly where she was supposed to be, and she had no idea why I sounded so shaken when I talked to her. I didn't tell her what had happened. I didn't want to worry her, and I wasn't sure she would believe me anyway. But hearing her real voice, calm and normal, and coming through the phone from our house 3 hours away, confirmed that whatever I had been hearing in the woods was not actually my wife. I spent one more night at the camp, but I didn't hunt the next day. Instead, I packed up my gear and drove home, cutting my hunting trip short for the first time in over 30 years. I told Margaret that I just wasn't ready to hunt alone yet, that I needed more time to process Jim's death before I could enjoy being in the woods without him. That was partially true, but the real reason I left was that I no longer felt safe in those mountains, knowing that something there could perfectly mimic human voices and use them to lead people astray. I've done some research since then about similar experiences, and I've found accounts from other hunters and hikers who have reported hearing familiar voices calling for help in remote wilderness areas, only to discover that the people they thought they heard were miles away and completely safe. The phenomenon seems to be particularly common in the Appalachian Mountains, and it's been reported by reliable witnesses for over a century. Some people call it the siren effect, comparing it to the mythological creatures that lured sailors to their deaths with beautiful singing. I've never returned to hunt in the Maple Hollow, and I probably never will. I still hunt in other areas of West Virginia, but never alone, and I'm much more cautious about following sounds that I can't immediately identify and locate. The experience taught me that these ancient mountains hold mysteries that go far beyond what we can explain with conventional understanding of nature and wildlife. There are forces in these hills that can manipulate our emotions and our perceptions in ways that are both subtle and terrifying. What disturbs me most about that day in November 2016 is how perfectly the voice matched Margaret's, down to the smallest details of pronunciation and emotion. Whatever was producing those sounds had somehow accessed not just the sound of her voice, but also intimate knowledge of how she would sound when she was frightened and calling for help. That level of mimicry suggests an intelligence that is both highly sophisticated and deeply malevolent, something that studies human behavior and uses that knowledge to exploit our deepest instincts and fears. I'm 67 years old now, and I've seen a lot of strange things in my time, but nothing has shaken me as much as hearing my wife's voice crying for help in a place where she couldn't possibly have been. It's made me realize that the Appalachian wilderness contains dangers that have nothing to do with wild animals or harsh weather, and that sometimes the most frightening predators are the ones that hunt using our own love and loyalty against us. My name is Crystal, and I'm 25 years old. I'm currently in my third year of nursing school at West Virginia University, and I spend a lot of time driving back and forth between the campus in Morgantown and my clinical rotation sites throughout the northern part of the state. It's demanding work. Between classroom studies, clinical rotations, and my part-time job at a local hospital, I'm usually putting in 60 to 70-hour weeks and driving hundreds of miles every week on mountain roads that can be challenging even in good weather. I'm used to being tired, I'm used to driving at odd hours, and I'm definitely used to seeing things that most people would find disturbing, given my work in hospital settings. But what I encountered on the evening of March 18th, 2020, was something that no amount of medical training or exhaustion could explain away. And it's left me convinced that there are forces in these mountains that can somehow sense impending disasters and try to warn people about them. I had just finished a 12-hour clinical rotation in the intensive care unit at Ruby Memorial Hospital in Morgantown, and I was driving home to my apartment in Fairmont, about a 20-minute drive south on Interstate 79. It was around 9:30 p.m., and I was exhausted after a particularly difficult shift that had involved 2 cardiac arrests and a trauma case that had kept me on my feet for most of the day. March 18th was also significant because it was during the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, when hospitals were just starting to implement new safety protocols and everyone was on edge about what might be coming. The stress level in healthcare settings was incredibly high, and all of us students were working extra hours to help with the increased patient load. The drive from Morgantown to Fairmont takes you through some beautiful but isolated mountain country, and there's a stretch of about 10 miles where you don't see many other vehicles, especially late at night. I had made this drive hundreds of times, and I knew every curve and hill along the route. The weather that night was clear and cold, typical for March in West Virginia, with good visibility and dry roads. I remember feeling relieved to be heading home after such a long day, and I was looking forward to getting a few hours of sleep before my next clinical rotation started early the next morning. About halfway home, as I was approaching the bridge that crosses the Monongahela River just south of Star City, I noticed something unusual in my headlights. At first, I thought it was a large bird that had been startled by my car and was flying parallel to the road. But as I got closer, I realized that what I was seeing was far too large to be any normal bird. The creature was flying alongside my car at about the same speed I was traveling, around 55 miles per hour, and it was staying perfectly even with my driver's side window, maybe 30 feet away from the road. I slowed down to get a better look, thinking that maybe I was seeing some kind of optical illusion created by shadows or reflections from my headlights. But as my speed decreased, the creature adjusted its flight pattern to match, continuing to pace my car with what seemed like deliberate intent. That's when I got my first clear view of what I was dealing with, and I felt my heart start racing in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion or caffeine. The creature was enormous. I would estimate it had a wingspan of at least 12 feet, maybe more. Its body was dark, almost black, and seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, making it difficult to make out specific details. But what I could see clearly were its eyes, which were glowing bright red and seemed to be looking directly at me through my car window. The eyes weren't reflecting my headlights the way an animal's eyes would. They were generating their own light, pulsing with an intensity that was both hypnotic and terrifying. I had heard stories about the Mothman my entire life. Anyone who grows up in West Virginia knows the legends about the winged creature that was supposedly seen around Point Pleasant in the 1960s, and how it was connected to the Silver Bridge collapse in 1967 that killed 46 people. But I had always dismissed those stories as folklore, the kind of local legends that every region has to attract tourists and sell books. Seeing this creature flying beside my car, though, made me realize that there might be more truth to those old stories than I had ever imagined. The creature followed my car for what felt like several minutes, but was probably only 30 or 40 seconds. During that time, I had the strangest sensation that it was trying to communicate with me somehow. Not through sound or words, but through some kind of direct mental contact. I felt an overwhelming sense of urgency and warning, as if the creature was trying to tell me that something terrible was about to happen and that I needed to be prepared for it. The feeling was so strong that I actually pulled over to the side of the road, thinking that maybe the creature was trying to warn me about some immediate danger, like a car accident or a medical emergency. As soon as I stopped the car, the creature hovered above the road for a moment, its red eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made me feel like it was looking directly into my soul. Then, without any warning, it let out a sound that I can only describe as the most haunting and mournful cry I've ever heard. The sound seemed to contain layers of meaning, sadness, warning, and something like resignation all mixed together. After making that sound, the creature flew directly toward the bridge ahead of me, circled it several times as if examining it closely, and then disappeared into the darkness. I sat in my car for several minutes, shaking and trying to process what I had just witnessed. My nursing training had taught me to be observational and analytical, to look for logical explanations for unusual phenomena. But there was no rational way to explain what I had seen. The creature had been too large and too unusual to be any known species of bird or bat, and its behavior had been too deliberate and intelligent to be explained as random animal activity. I eventually continued my drive home, but I kept thinking about the creature's focus on the bridge and the overwhelming sense of warning I had felt during our encounter. The Monongahela River Bridge that the creature had circled was a major transportation link for the region, carrying thousands of vehicles every day between Morgantown and communities to the south. If something were to happen to that bridge, it would be a catastrophic disaster affecting hundreds of people. 3 days later, on March 21st, 2020, I was driving to another clinical rotation when I saw emergency vehicles and construction crews blocking access to the same bridge where I had encountered the Mothman. I pulled over and asked one of the construction workers what was happening, and he told me that routine safety inspections had discovered serious structural problems with the bridge's support systems. The bridge was immediately closed to all traffic while emergency repairs were made, and engineers later said that the structure had been on the verge of catastrophic failure that could have occurred at any time. The news reports about the bridge closure mentioned that if the structural problems hadn't been discovered when they were, the bridge could have collapsed without warning, potentially during rush hour when it was packed with commuters. The engineering assessment concluded that the bridge had been unsafe for several weeks before the problems were detected, meaning that thousands of people had been crossing a structure that could have failed at any moment. When I heard this news, I immediately thought about my encounter with the Mothman and the creature's strange behavior around that bridge. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. I had seen the creature examining the bridge just 3 days before serious structural problems were discovered that required immediate emergency closure. It seemed clear to me that somehow the creature had known about the danger and had been trying to warn people about the impending disaster. I started researching the history of Mothman sightings in West Virginia, particularly the famous incidents around Point Pleasant in the 1960s. What I learned was fascinating and disturbing. The original Mothman sightings in 1966 and 1967 followed a very similar pattern to what I had experienced. Witnesses reported encounters with a large, winged creature with glowing red eyes that seemed to be trying to communicate warnings about impending disasters. The sightings culminated with the collapse of the Silver Bridge on December 15, 1967, which killed 46 people and injured many others. Reading the accounts of those earlier witnesses, I was struck by how closely their descriptions matched what I had seen. The physical appearance of the creature, the way it seemed to study infrastructure like bridges and buildings, the sense of urgency and warning that witnesses felt during encounters. All of these elements were consistent across decades of reports. It suggested that either the same creature or similar creatures had been appearing in West Virginia for over 50 years, always in connection with impending disasters. What made my encounter particularly significant was that it occurred during the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, when the world was facing a crisis unlike anything we had seen in generations. Hospitals were preparing for massive influxes of patients, supply chains were breaking down, and entire communities were about to be locked down to prevent the spread of the virus. In retrospect, March 2020 was the beginning of a disaster that would affect millions of people worldwide. And perhaps the Mothman's appearance was somehow connected to the broader sense of impending catastrophe that was about to unfold. I've had several more encounters with unusual phenomena since that night in March 2020, though nothing as dramatic as my Mothman sighting. I've seen strange lights in the sky while driving home from late shifts, heard unexplained sounds coming from the forests around the hospital, and occasionally felt that same sense of warning and urgency that I experienced during my encounter with the winged creature. Each time, these experiences have been followed within days or weeks by news of accidents, natural disasters, or other tragic events in the region. I'm now in my final year of nursing school, and I've learned to trust my instincts about danger and warning signs, both in medical settings and in my daily life. The healthcare field has taught me that there are often subtle signs of impending problems that most people miss, and that paying attention to these warning signals can literally save lives. My encounter with the Mothman has convinced me that there are forces in these mountains that operate on a similar principle, somehow sensing disasters before they occur and trying to warn people who are sensitive enough to understand their messages. I still drive the same routes through the mountains of West Virginia for my clinical rotations, and I always pay attention to unusual phenomena that I might encounter along the way. I've learned that the Appalachian Mountains are home to mysteries that go far beyond what we can explain with conventional science or logic, and that sometimes we're lucky enough to receive warnings about dangers that we might not otherwise see coming. The Mothman that I encountered on that bridge in March 2020 was trying to protect people from a disaster that could have killed dozens or hundreds of innocent commuters, and I feel privileged to have been chosen as a witness to that warning. I may never fully understand what the Mothman is or where it comes from, but I know that my encounter with it changed my perspective on the world and made me more aware of the hidden connections between seemingly unrelated events. In a profession like nursing, where we're constantly dealing with life and death situations, having that kind of heightened awareness and sensitivity to warning signs is invaluable. The mountains of West Virginia have taught me that there are guardians watching over us, even when we don't realize they're there. And sometimes they appear in forms that challenge everything we think we know about reality. My name is Tommy Sawyer, and I'm 31 years old. I work as a park maintenance worker for the National Park Service in the Great Smoky Mountains, primarily in the North Carolina section of the park. It's honest work that I've been doing for the past 7 years, and it keeps me outdoors in some of the most beautiful country in America. My job involves everything from trail maintenance and facility repairs to wildlife monitoring and visitor safety support. I'm comfortable working alone in remote areas of the park, and I've seen just about everything you can imagine. From dangerous wildlife encounters to search and rescue operations to the occasional drug smuggling operation that tries to use park trails for illegal activities. But what I discovered during the summer of 2022 has left me questioning whether there are organized groups operating in these mountains that are involved in activities far more disturbing than anything I was prepared to deal with. It was July 15th, 2022. And I was assigned to do maintenance work on some of the less frequently used trails in the Cataloochee Valley area. Specifically, the Rough Fork Trail that leads back into some of the most remote sections of the park. This trail sees maybe a dozen hikers per week during peak season, and it requires regular maintenance to keep it passable because of frequent tree falls and erosion from mountain streams. I had been working alone on the trail for most of the morning, clearing fallen branches and repairing some wooden bridges that had been damaged by recent storms. Around noon, I decided to take a break and eat my lunch near a small clearing that's about 3 miles from the main trailhead. It's a spot I've used many times over the years. Quiet, peaceful and far enough off the beaten path that you rarely encounter other people there. As I was walking toward my usual lunch spot, though, I noticed that something was different about the clearing. There were objects scattered around the area that definitely hadn't been there during my last maintenance visit 2 weeks earlier. When I got closer, I realized that what I was seeing was an arrangement of animal bones that had been deliberately placed in specific patterns around the clearing. There were dozens of bones, mostly from deer, but also what looked like smaller animals like raccoons and possums, that had been cleaned completely of any flesh or tissue and arranged in geometric designs on the forest floor. The bones were positioned in concentric circles, with larger bones like femurs and skulls forming the outer rings and smaller bones filling in the interior spaces. At first, I thought it might be the work of some kind of natural predator or scavenger that had been collecting bones in the area. But the arrangements were far too organized and deliberate to be the result of animal behavior. The bones had been placed with obvious intent, and many of them had been positioned in ways that would be impossible for any animal to achieve. Some of the skulls were balanced on top of vertical bones, creating structures that required careful engineering to remain stable. As I examined the bone arrangements more closely, I started to notice other disturbing details. Many of the bones had symbols carved into them, not random scratches or natural wear marks, but deliberate carvings that formed recognizable patterns. The symbols weren't anything I recognized from mainstream religions or cultures, but they had a consistency that suggested they were part of some organized belief system or ritual practice. Some symbols appeared to be variations of ancient Celtic or Germanic runes, while others looked more like Native American petroglyphs. But there were also completely unfamiliar designs that I couldn't identify. The trees around the clearing had also been marked with similar symbols. Someone had used a sharp knife or carving tool to cut deep designs into the bark of at least a dozen trees, creating a ring of marked trees around the bone arrangements. The carvings were fresh. The bark was still white and sappy where it had been cut, indicating that the symbols had been carved within the past few weeks. The consistency of the carving depth and style suggested that all of the symbols had been made by the same person or group of people. I spent about an hour documenting everything I'd found, taking photographs of the bone arrangements and tree carvings from multiple angles, and making detailed notes about the location and condition of everything I observed. As a park employee, I'm trained to document and report any unusual activities or discoveries, especially anything that might indicate illegal activity or pose a threat to visitor safety. What I had found clearly fell into that category, even though I wasn't sure exactly what kind of activity I was dealing with. When I returned to the park headquarters that afternoon, I immediately reported my discovery to my supervisor, Linda Chen, who has been with the Park Service for over 15 years and has dealt with just about every kind of incident you can imagine. I showed her the photographs I had taken and described the location and extent of what I had found. Her reaction was more serious than I had expected. She immediately contacted the park's law enforcement division and asked me to prepare a detailed written report documenting everything I had observed. The next day, I was asked to guide a team of park rangers and investigators back to the site to conduct a more thorough examination of the area. What they found was even more disturbing, though, than what I had initially discovered. A more careful search of the surrounding forest revealed several other locations where similar bone arrangements and tree carvings had been created, forming a pattern that extended over several square miles of remote park territory. The investigators also found evidence of recent campfires and temporary shelters, indicating that people had been spending extended periods of time in the area. Most disturbing of all, the investigators discovered that some of the bones in the arrangements weren't from wild animals. Mixed in with the deer and small mammal bones were what appeared to be domestic animal bones, dogs, cats, and possibly other pets that had been killed and added to the collections. The investigators couldn't determine whether the domestic animals had been killed specifically for these rituals or whether the bones had been obtained some other way. But the presence of pet remains and suggested that whatever group was responsible for these activities was escalating their behavior in concerning ways. The Park Service immediately launched a full investigation, including coordination with local law enforcement agencies and consultation with experts in cult activities and occult practices. I was interviewed several times about my discovery and asked to provide additional details about anything unusual I might have observed in the area over the past several months. During these interviews, I remembered seeing what I had thought were hikers camping in remote areas of the park during my previous maintenance visits. But now I realized that these might have been members of the group responsible for the bone arrangements. About a week after my initial discovery, things took a much more personal and frightening turn. When I arrived at work one morning, I found that someone had left a collection of animal bones arranged in a pattern on the hood of my personal vehicle, which was parked in the employee lot at park headquarters. The bones were arranged in the same style as the ones I had found in the forest, and they included some of the same carved symbols that had been cut into the trees. There was also a handwritten note tucked under one of the bones that simply said, "Forget what you saw." I immediately reported this incident to park law enforcement, and they treated it as a serious threat against a federal employee. The parking area was examined for fingerprints and other evidence, and security cameras were reviewed to try to identify who might have placed the bones on my vehicle. Unfortunately, the cameras didn't capture clear images of the person responsible, and no useful physical evidence was recovered from the bones or the note. The threatening message made it clear that someone involved in creating the bone arrangements knew that I had discovered them and reported them to authorities. This was particularly disturbing because it meant that the group responsible for these activities was monitoring park service operations and keeping track of individual employees. The fact that they were able to access the employee parking area without being detected also suggested that they had detailed knowledge of park facilities and security procedures. Over the next several weeks, I received 2 more threatening messages, both left at my home address rather than at work. The first was another arrangement of bones, this time placed on my front porch with a note that said, "Mind your own business." The second was more explicit. A photograph of me taken from a distance while I was working on trail maintenance, with my face circled in red marker and the words, "We know where you work," written across the bottom. At this point, I was genuinely frightened for my safety and the safety of my family. The people responsible for these threats clearly had the ability to track my movements and access both my workplace and my home without being detected. I started varying my daily routines, checking my vehicle for tampering before driving it, and carrying pepper spray while working alone in remote areas of the park. I also asked to be reassigned to work areas closer to park headquarters and visitor centers, where there would always be other people around. The Park Service investigation continued for several more months. But despite extensive efforts by multiple law enforcement agencies, the people responsible for the bone arrangements and threatening messages were never identified or arrested. The investigation did reveal that similar activities had been reported in other parts of the Appalachian Mountains over the past several years, suggesting that there might be a network of related groups operating throughout the region. Some of the symbols found at our site matched symbols that had been discovered at similar locations in Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky. What was most disturbing about the investigation's findings was the indication that these groups might be involved in activities beyond just collecting animal bones and carving symbols into trees. Law enforcement experts who consulted on the case said that the patterns of behavior we had documented were consistent with cult groups that sometimes escalate from animal sacrifice to more serious criminal activities. The fact that domestic animal remains had been found mixed with wild animal bones was particularly concerning, as it suggested a willingness to cross ethical boundaries that might lead to even more serious crimes. I continued working for the Park Service for about 6 more months after the investigation concluded. But I never felt completely safe in remote areas of the park again. Every time I was working alone on trail maintenance, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder and listening for unusual sounds that might indicate someone was watching me. The stress of the situation was affecting my work performance and my personal life. And I eventually decided to transfer to a different position with the Park Service in a different state. Before I left North Carolina, I learned that the bone arrangements and tree carvings had been discovered again in several new locations throughout the Great Smoky Mountains, indicating that whatever group was responsible for these activities was still active and expanding their operations. Park officials decided not to publicize these discoveries because they didn't want to attract copycat activities or interfere with the ongoing law enforcement investigation, but they did increase security patrols in remote areas and implemented new safety protocols for employees working alone. Looking back on this experience, what troubles me most is the realization that there are organized groups operating in our national parks that are engaged in activities that most people would find deeply disturbing and threatening. These mountains have always attracted people who want to escape from mainstream society, and most of them are harmless individuals who just want to live quietly in natural settings. But there are also groups that use the isolation and vastness of these wilderness areas to engage in practices that they couldn't pursue in more populated areas. The Appalachian Mountains contain thousands of square miles of remote territory where people can operate without any oversight or interference from law enforcement. For groups that are involved in cult activities, animal sacrifice, or other illegal practices, this remoteness provides perfect cover for activities that would be immediately detected and stopped in urban or suburban settings. The fact that my discovery of their bone arrangements led to personal threats suggests that these groups are serious about protecting their operations and are willing to intimidate or potentially harm anyone who interferes with their activities. I now work for the Park Service in Colorado, where the terrain and culture are very different from the Appalachian Mountains. But I still think about what I discovered in the Great Smoky Mountains, and I wonder how many other similar groups are operating in the remote areas of our national parks. The experience taught me that these wilderness areas, which most people think of as places of natural beauty and peace, can also be home to human activities that are far more dangerous and disturbing than any wild animal or natural hazard. My name is Regina, and I'm 29 years old. I work as a geologist for the United States Geological Survey, specializing in metamorphic rock formations and geological mapping in the Appalachian Mountain region. I have a master's degree in geology from Virginia Tech, and I've been working in the field for the past 6 years, conducting research and surveys throughout the eastern United States. My work requires me to spend long periods alone in remote areas, taking core samples, measuring rock formations, and documenting geological features that help us understand the Earth's history and structure. I'm comfortable working independently in wilderness settings, and I'm trained in wilderness survival and safety protocols. But what happened to me during a research trip on August 12, 2023, has challenged everything I thought I understood about the physical laws that govern our reality. I was conducting a geological survey in a remote area of the Blue Ridge Parkway in Virginia, specifically studying the metamorphic rock formations near milepost 78, which is known for its unique mineral compositions and geological complexity. This area contains some of the oldest rocks in North America, dating back over 1 billion years, and it provides valuable insights into the geological processes that shaped the Appalachian Mountains. My assignment was to spend 3 days in the area, collecting rock samples and documenting the geological features for a comprehensive study being conducted by my department. The research site was located about 2 miles off the main parkway, accessible only by a narrow hiking trail that winds through dense forest and crosses several small streams. I had hiked this trail before during preliminary visits to the area, and I was familiar with the terrain and the location of the specific rock formations I needed to study. The area is rarely visited by tourists because it requires a moderate hike to reach and doesn't offer the scenic overlooks that most Blue Ridge Parkway visitors are looking for. On August 12th, I was working near a small mountain lake that locals call Mirror Lake because of how perfectly it reflects the surrounding forest and sky. The lake is only about a quarter-mile across, but it's surprisingly deep for its size, and it's fed by underground springs that keep the water crystal clear year-round. I had set up my equipment on the rocky shore of the lake, where I could access the specific rock formations I needed to study, while also having a clean water source for my sampling procedures. I had been working for about 3 hours that morning, taking core samples and making detailed measurements of the rock layers, when I decided to take a break and eat an early lunch. I walked over to a flat rock near the water's edge, where I could sit comfortably and enjoy the peaceful setting while I ate. The lake was perfectly still that day, creating a mirror-like surface that reflected the forest canopy and the blue sky above with startling clarity. It was one of those perfect moments that remind you why you chose to work in outdoor settings, despite the physical demands and isolation that the job requires. As I sat there eating my sandwich and reviewing my morning's data collection, I happened to glance across the lake toward the opposite shore, maybe 200 yards away. What I saw there made me drop my sandwich and grab my binoculars for a closer look. There was someone walking along the far shore of the lake, moving from left to right at a steady pace. At first, I thought it might be another researcher, or perhaps a hiker who had gotten lost and ended up in this remote area. Though it would be unusual for someone to find this location without specific directions, I focused my binoculars on the figure across the lake and immediately felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The person I was looking at was wearing exactly the same clothes I was wearing: khaki field pants, a blue geological survey shirt, and a tan field vest with multiple pockets. They had the same build as me, the same height, and the same dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. In fact, as far as I could tell through my binoculars, the person walking on the opposite shore looked exactly like me. I stood up quickly, thinking that maybe I was seeing some kind of optical illusion or reflection effect caused by the lake's mirror-like surface. But as I moved, I could see that the figure across the lake moved differently. While I was standing still and looking through binoculars, the other person continued walking steadily along the shoreline, seemingly unaware of my presence. I watched for several minutes, and the figure's movements were completely independent of mine. They would stop to examine rocks, bend down to collect samples, and look across the lake in my direction, all while I remained stationary. The most unnerving part of the experience was when the other person, my doppelganger, I suppose, stopped walking and looked directly at me across the lake. Even though we were separated by 200 yards of water, I could clearly see through my binoculars that this person was looking straight at me with what appeared to be the same binoculars I was using. For what felt like several minutes, but was probably only 30 seconds, we stood there staring at each other across the water. Then the other person raised their hand and waved at me. I was so startled by this gesture that I automatically waved back before I fully processed what I was doing. As soon as I waved, the other person lowered their binoculars and resumed walking along the shoreline, continuing in the same direction they had been going before they stopped to look at me. I watched them until they disappeared behind a stand of trees at the far end of the lake. And then I stood there for several more minutes, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. My first thought was that I needed to document this experience scientifically, so I immediately checked my equipment to see if I could find any explanation for what I had seen. I examined my geological instruments, which include several devices that measure electromagnetic fields, ground vibrations, and atmospheric conditions as part of my standard data collection procedures. What I found was deeply disturbing. All of my instruments were showing readings that were completely off the charts, indicating electromagnetic anomalies that were orders of magnitude beyond anything I had ever recorded in the field. My magnetometer, which normally shows steady readings that reflect the Earth's natural magnetic field, was fluctuating wildly between extreme positive and negative values. The electromagnetic field detector was registering energy signatures that were so intense, they maxed out the instrument's measurement capabilities. Even my GPS unit was malfunctioning, showing an error message and unable to acquire satellite signals, despite the clear sky and open terrain around the lake. I spent the next hour trying to troubleshoot my equipment and determine whether there might be some natural explanation for these anomalous readings. I checked all the battery connections, ran diagnostic tests on the instruments, and tried moving to different locations around the lake to see if the readings would normalize. But no matter where I went or what I did, my instruments continued to show the same impossible measurements, indicating that the entire area around Mirror Lake was somehow saturated with electromagnetic energy at levels that shouldn't exist in nature. While I was working with my instruments, I kept glancing across the lake to see if I might catch another glimpse of the person who looked like me, but I never saw them again. I did notice, however, that the water in the lake had become strangely still, not just calm, but completely motionless in a way that seemed unnatural. There was no wind that day, but even on completely calm days, there's usually some small movement on the surface of a lake from underwater currents or fish activity. Mirror Lake had become so still that it looked more like a sheet of glass than water. Around 2 p.m., the electromagnetic anomalies suddenly stopped, and all of my instruments returned to normal readings within the span of about 5 minutes. The GPS unit reacquired satellite signals, the magnetometer stabilized at normal levels, and the electromagnetic field detector showed background readings consistent with typical mountain environments. The lake's surface also began to show normal small ripples and movements that you would expect from natural water currents. I immediately documented everything that had happened, including the timestamps from my instruments, photographs of the equipment readings, and detailed notes about my visual observations of the doppelganger figure. I also collected water and rock samples from around the lake to have them analyzed later for any unusual chemical or mineral compositions that might explain the electromagnetic phenomena I had recorded. When I returned to my office 3 days later, I had the samples analyzed and submitted my instrument data to colleagues who specialize in geophysical anomalies. The results were inconclusive. The water and rock samples showed normal mineral compositions, with no unusual elements that would explain electromagnetic disturbances. And the instrument readings were so far outside normal parameters that my colleagues initially assumed there had been equipment malfunctions. However, when I showed them that multiple independent instruments had recorded the same anomalies simultaneously, and that all of the equipment had returned to normal function immediately after the incident, they became more interested in the data. One colleague who studies atmospheric electrical phenomena suggested that the area around Mirror Lake might have experienced some kind of natural electromagnetic pulse, possibly caused by underground geological activity or unusual atmospheric conditions. I returned to Mirror Lake 2 more times over the following months, hoping to observe similar phenomena or collect additional data about the electromagnetic anomalies I had recorded. During these return visits, I brought more sophisticated monitoring equipment and spent longer periods observing the area. I never saw the doppelganger figure again, and I never recorded electromagnetic readings as extreme as those from August 12th. But I did document several smaller anomalies that suggested the area experiences periodic disturbances in its electromagnetic environment. What troubles me most about this experience is that it challenges fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality and the reliability of scientific observation. As a geologist, I'm trained to observe natural phenomena objectively and to look for rational explanations based on established scientific principles. But what I witnessed at Mirror Lake doesn't fit into any conventional understanding of physics or geology. The possibility that I saw some kind of dimensional reflection or parallel version of myself suggests that there might be aspects of reality that our current scientific understanding can't explain or measure. The electromagnetic anomalies I recorded indicate that something extraordinary was happening in that location, something that affected the very fabric of space and electromagnetic energy in ways that shouldn't be possible according to our current knowledge of physics. I've researched similar phenomena and found scattered reports from other scientists and researchers who have encountered unexplained doppelganger sightings, usually in remote areas with unusual geological or electromagnetic characteristics. Most of these reports are dismissed as optical illusions or psychological phenomena. But the consistency of the descriptions and the correlation with electromagnetic anomalies suggests that there might be genuine physical phenomena behind these experiences. The Blue Ridge Mountains are geologically complex, with rock formations that date back over 1 billion years and have been subjected to enormous geological forces over vast periods of time. It's possible that these ancient mountains contain energy patterns or dimensional characteristics that we don't yet understand, and that under certain conditions, these characteristics can create effects that challenge our normal perception of reality. I continue to work as a geologist in the Appalachian region, but my experience at Mirror Lake has made me more open to the possibility that there are natural phenomena in these mountains that go beyond what conventional science can currently explain. I always carry more sophisticated monitoring equipment now, and I pay closer attention to unusual readings that might indicate electromagnetic anomalies or other unexplained activity. The mountains of Appalachia are ancient and mysterious, and they've witnessed geological processes and time scales that are almost impossible for humans to comprehend. Perhaps sometimes, under the right conditions, we get glimpses of realities or dimensions that normally exist beyond our perception. And maybe that's what happened to me on that August afternoon when I saw myself walking on the far shore of Mirror Lake. My name is Steve, and I'm 45 years old. I work as a postal worker for the United States Postal Service, delivering mail in the rural communities around State College, Pennsylvania. It's steady work that I've been doing for the past 18 years, and it keeps me active and outdoors, which I appreciate. In my free time, I'm an avid section hiker on the Appalachian Trail, and over the past 12 years, I've completed about 1,800 miles of the trail in segments during weekends and vacation time. My goal is to become a 2,000-miler by completing the entire trail, and I usually manage to hike 150 to 200 miles per year, depending on my work schedule and family obligations. I know the trail community pretty well, and I'm familiar with the culture, the protocols, and the unwritten rules that govern how hikers interact with each other in the wilderness. But what happened to me during a section hike in October 2017 has left me questioning whether some of the people we encounter on the trail are actually still among the living. I was planning to hike a 35-mile section of the AT through central Pennsylvania, starting at the Pine Grove Furnace State Park and ending at the Susquehanna River near Duncannon. It's a relatively easy section with moderate elevation changes and good access to water sources, making it perfect for a 3-day weekend trip. I had hiked parts of this section before, but never the entire stretch in one trip. And I was looking forward to completing another significant segment of my overall AT goal. The weather forecast looked ideal for hiking: cool temperatures, clear skies, and no precipitation expected. I started my hike on Friday morning, October 13th, carrying a 3-day pack with all the gear I needed for camping and cooking along the trail. The first day's hiking was uneventful and enjoyable, covering about 12 miles through mixed forests that were showing beautiful fall colors. I encountered a few other hikers during the day, mostly day hikers and weekend backpackers like myself, but nothing unusual or memorable about any of those interactions. That evening, I set up camp at a designated camping area near Boiling Springs, where there's a reliable water source and established fire rings for cooking. Around 7:30 p.m., as I was finishing dinner and getting ready to hang my food bag for the night, another hiker emerged from the southbound direction and asked if he could share the camping area. This is completely normal on the AT. Camping areas are meant to be shared, and it's considered good trail etiquette to welcome other hikers, especially if they're hiking alone like I was. The hiker introduced himself as Bill and said he was section hiking northbound, planning to reach Harrisburg in a few more days. Bill appeared to be in his early 60s, with gray hair and a full beard, and he was carrying what looked like well-used but high-quality hiking gear. His backpack was an older model that you don't see much anymore, but it was, obviously, well-maintained and properly fitted. He was wearing wool clothing and leather boots, which struck me as a bit old-fashioned compared to the synthetic materials and lightweight gear that most modern hikers prefer. But there are still some old-school hikers who swear by traditional materials and equipment. What I found most interesting about Bill was his knowledge of AT history and trail culture. As we sat around the campfire that evening, he told stories about hiking the trail that went back to the 1970s and 1980s, long before I'd ever heard of the Appalachian Trail. He knew details about trail relocations, old shelters that had been torn down decades ago, and changes in trail management that had occurred over the years. He also knew the trail names and stories of legendary hikers from the early days of AT hiking, people who had become famous in the hiking community for their accomplishments or their colorful personalities. Bill's stories were fascinating, and I found myself staying up much later than I usually do when I'm hiking alone. He had an easy, friendly manner of speaking, and his knowledge of trail history made him an entertaining companion for the evening. He told me about hiking the trail before GPS was available, when navigation was done entirely with maps and compass, and about the days when trail shelters were much more primitive and water sources were less reliable than they are now. One story that particularly impressed me was his detailed account of hiking through this same section of Pennsylvania in 1989, when Hurricane Hugo had caused massive tree damage along the trail. He described specific locations where fallen trees had blocked the trail for months, and detours that had been set up to bypass damaged areas. His descriptions were so detailed and accurate that I could visualize exactly what he was talking about. Even though the hurricane damage had been cleared up decades before I started hiking this section. Around 10:30 p.m., we both decided it was time to get some sleep, since we were both planning to start hiking early the next morning. Bill set up his sleeping bag on the opposite side of the fire ring from where I had placed my tent, and we said goodnight, like any two hikers sharing a campsite. I fell asleep quickly, tired from the day's hiking and relaxed by the warmth of the campfire and Bill's interesting conversation. When I woke up the next morning around 6:30 a.m., Bill was already gone. His sleeping bag and gear had been packed up, and there was no sign that anyone else had camped in the area. This wasn't unusual. Many hikers prefer to start early to avoid afternoon heat or to reach their next destination before dark. I assumed that Bill had gotten an early start and was already several miles up the trail ahead of me. I packed up my own gear and started hiking northbound around 7:30 a.m., expecting that I might catch up with Bill during the day, or at least see him at one of the trail shelters or road crossings along the route. The second day's hiking took me through some beautiful sections of Pennsylvania forest, and I made good time despite stopping frequently to enjoy the scenery and take photographs of the fall foliage. Around noon, I reached the town of Boiling Springs, where the AT passes directly through a small community that's very welcoming to hikers. There's a small outfitter shop, a convenience store, and several restaurants that cater to trail hikers, and it's a popular resupply stop for people doing longer sections of the trail. I decided to stop for lunch and to buy some additional snacks for the remainder of my trip. While I was eating lunch at a local deli, I struck up a conversation with the owner, who was familiar with AT hikers and enjoyed hearing about people's trail experiences. I mentioned that I had camped with another hiker named Bill the previous night, and described our conversation about AT history and the hurricane damage from 1989. The deli owner listened with interest, and then asked me to describe what Bill looked like. When I described Bill's appearance, his gray hair and beard, his age, and his old-fashioned hiking gear, the deli owner's expression changed to one of surprise and concern. He asked me several more detailed questions about Bill's appearance and the stories he had told. And then he went into the back room of the restaurant and returned with a photograph that he showed to me. The photograph showed a group of hikers at what appeared to be a trail celebration or reunion event, and the deli owner pointed to one person in the group. It was unmistakably Bill. The same gray hair and beard, the same facial features, even wearing similar wool clothing to what I had seen the night before. The deli owner told me that the photograph had been taken in 1989, and that the person I had described was Bill Henderson, a well-known AT section hiker who had been very active in the trail community during the 1980s and early 1990s. What made this discovery disturbing was what the deli owner told me next. Bill Henderson had died in 1989, just a few months after Hurricane Hugo, while hiking alone on the AT in Virginia. He had apparently suffered a heart attack while climbing a steep section of trail, and his body had been found several days later by other hikers. The trail community had been deeply saddened by his death, because Bill had been a beloved figure who was known for his kindness to other hikers and his extensive knowledge of trail history. I showed the deli owner a photograph that I had taken of Bill with my phone during our evening around the campfire, thinking that this would prove that I had actually met someone, even if it wasn't the Bill Henderson who had died in 1989. But when I opened the photo file on my phone, I was shocked to discover that the image showed only me sitting alone by the campfire. Bill was completely absent from the photograph, even though I clearly remembered him being there when I took the picture. I checked all of the other photos I had taken during that evening, thinking that maybe I had captured Bill in one of the other images. But every photograph showed only me and the campfire. There was no evidence in any of the images that anyone else had been present at the campsite, despite my clear memories of spending hours in conversation with Bill and seeing him set up his sleeping area across the fire ring from my tent. The deli owner could see that I was shaken by this revelation, and he told me that I wasn't the first person over the years to report encountering Bill Henderson on the trail. He said that several other hikers had described meeting an older man named Bill, who told detailed stories about AT history and who matched Henderson's physical description exactly. In each case, the witnesses had been hiking alone, and in each case, photographic evidence had later shown that they had actually been alone during the encounters they remembered. I spent the rest of that day hiking in a state of confusion and unease, trying to process what I had learned and wondering whether I was losing my mind or had somehow experienced something genuinely supernatural. The conversation with Bill had felt completely real and normal. He had seemed like flesh and blood, had eaten food from his own pack, and had interacted with me in ways that seemed impossible, if he was some kind of ghost or hallucination. When I reached the next trail shelter that evening, I met 2 other section hikers who were planning to stay there for the night. I decided to tell them about my encounter with Bill and see if they had heard similar stories from other hikers. To my surprise, one of them immediately knew what I was talking about. He said that stories about encounters with Bill Henderson were well known in the AT hiking community, and that there was even an informal name for the phenomenon: Bill sightings. According to this hiker, Bill Henderson had been such a dedicated and passionate trail hiker during his life that many people believed his spirit continued to hike sections of the AT after his death, particularly helping solo hikers who might be feeling lonely or uncertain about their journey. The encounters always followed a similar pattern. Bill would appear to hikers who were camping alone, would spend the evening sharing stories and trail wisdom, and would disappear by morning without leaving any physical evidence of his presence. I completed my planned section hike the next day. But the encounter with Bill Henderson had changed the entire character of the trip. Instead of feeling accomplished about completing another segment of the AT, I felt unsettled and confused about the nature of reality and the possibility of supernatural experiences. I had always been skeptical about ghost stories and paranormal claims, but there was no rational way to explain what I had experienced. Over the following months, I did extensive research about Bill Henderson and discovered that many of the historical details he had shared with me during our evening together were accurate and verifiable. His descriptions of hurricane damage, trail relocations, and changes in trail management all corresponded to documented events from the 1980s. The stories he told about other hikers and trail personalities were also accurate according to people who had known Bill during his lifetime. What was most remarkable was that some of the information Bill had shared with me wasn't readily available in books or online resources about AT history. The details about specific trail conditions during the 1989 hurricane, and his knowledge of temporary detours and shelter conditions from that era, suggested access to information that would only be known to someone who had actually experienced those events firsthand. I've continued section hiking on the AT since my encounter with Bill Henderson, and I've completed over 200 additional miles toward my goal of becoming a 2,000-miler. I've never had another encounter with Bill, but I've met several other hikers who have reported similar experiences with him over the years. The consistency of these reports, combined with the verifiable accuracy of the historical information that Bill shares, has convinced me that there are aspects of the trail experience that go beyond what we can explain with conventional understanding. The Appalachian Trail passes through some of the oldest mountains in North America, and it's been walked by thousands of people over the past century who have developed deep emotional connections to the trail and the wilderness it traverses. Perhaps some of those connections are strong enough to persist beyond death, allowing dedicated hikers like Bill Henderson to continue sharing their love of the trail with others who are following in their footsteps. My encounter with Bill has made me more open to the possibility that the mountains and forests of Appalachia contain spiritual energy and presences that we don't fully understand. The trail itself has become sacred to many people who have hiked it, and maybe that sacredness creates space for experiences that transcend the normal boundaries between life and death. I may never fully understand what happened during that October night in 2017, but I'm grateful for the time I spent with Bill Henderson, whether he was a ghost, a spirit, or something else entirely beyond my comprehension. My name is Ashley, and I'm 22 years old. I'm a junior at Eastern Kentucky University, majoring in environmental science with a focus on Appalachian ecology. I grew up in Lexington, but I've always been drawn to the mountains and wilderness areas of Eastern Kentucky, and my studies have given me plenty of opportunities to spend time in some of the most remote and beautiful parts of the Cumberland Gap region. I'm comfortable camping and hiking in backcountry areas, And I've done dozens of research trips and recreational camping excursions throughout the Daniel Boone National Forest and the surrounding mountains. I consider myself a rational, scientifically minded person who approaches unusual phenomena with healthy skepticism and a desire to find logical explanations. But what happened to me and my friends during a camping trip in May 2019 has left me questioning whether there are forces operating in these mountains that go far beyond anything science can currently explain. I was planning a 3-day camping trip with 5 of my college friends to celebrate the end of our spring semester. We had all been stressed about final exams and term papers, and we wanted to get away from campus and spend some time in nature before summer break began. I suggested we camp in an area of the Cumberland Gap that I'd visited several times for class field trips, a remote section of the Daniel Boone National Forest that locals call Devil's Den because of the deep ravines and cave systems that make the terrain particularly challenging and mysterious. The area we chose is about 15 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by a rough forest service trail that requires high-clearance vehicles and takes about an hour to navigate even under good conditions. It's not a popular destination for casual campers because of the difficult access and the lack of developed facilities. But that isolation was exactly what we were looking for. We wanted to get completely away from civilization for a few days and enjoy the kind of pristine wilderness experience that's becoming increasingly rare in the modern world. Our group consisted of myself and 5 friends from school. Marcus, who was studying geology, Jennifer and Sarah, who were both biology majors, David, who was majoring in forestry, and Kevin, who was studying environmental engineering. We were all outdoor enthusiasts with significant camping and hiking experience, and we had all the necessary equipment for safe backcountry camping, including GPS units, emergency communication devices, and comprehensive first aid supplies. We arrived at our chosen camping spot on Friday afternoon, May 17th, 2019, and spent several hours setting up our tents, organizing our gear, and exploring the immediate area around our campsite. The location was perfect, a small clearing surrounded by dense forest, with a reliable stream nearby for water and a fire ring that had obviously been used by previous campers. The weather was ideal for camping, with clear skies and comfortable temperatures predicted for the entire weekend. Friday evening was exactly what we had hoped for. Good food cooked over an open fire, interesting conversations about our studies and future plans, and the peaceful atmosphere that comes from being completely disconnected from the digital world and the stresses of college life. We stayed up until around midnight, enjoying the clear mountain air and the brilliant display of stars that you can only see in areas without light pollution. Saturday was spent hiking and exploring the surrounding area, including some of the cave entrances that give Devil's Den its name. We found several interesting geological formations that Marcus was excited to examine. And Jennifer and Sarah collected samples of unusual plant species that they wanted to identify back at school. It was the kind of day that reminded all of us why we had chosen to study environmental sciences. There's nothing quite like experiencing wilderness areas firsthand to reinforce your commitment to protecting and understanding natural ecosystems. Saturday evening started out much like Friday night, with good food and relaxed conversation around the campfire. But around 10:30 p.m., David noticed something unusual in the sky above the mountains to the east of our campsite. At first, it looked like a bright star or planet. But as we watched, it became clear that the light was moving in ways that weren't consistent with any astronomical phenomena we were familiar with. The light appeared to be circular and was emitting a steady, white illumination that was much brighter than any aircraft navigation lights we had ever seen. It was moving slowly across the sky, but not in a straight line like an airplane or satellite. Instead, it was following a zigzag pattern, making sharp turns that would be impossible for any conventional aircraft. The movements were too precise and controlled to be explained as atmospheric phenomena like ball lightning or meteorological anomalies. As we watched, more lights appeared in the same area of the sky. Within about 10 minutes, we could count at least 7 separate light sources, all exhibiting the same unusual movement patterns and brightness characteristics. The lights seemed to be communicating with each other somehow. Because their movements became coordinated, they would form geometric patterns, move in synchronized formations, and respond to each other's movements in ways that suggested intelligent control. Marcus immediately grabbed his camera and started taking photographs of the lights, while Jennifer began timing their movements and recording detailed observations in her field notebook. David tried to use his GPS unit to determine the exact direction and elevation of the lights. But he discovered that his GPS was malfunctioning, showing error messages and unable to acquire satellite signals despite the clear sky conditions. The lights continued their unusual behavior for about 20 minutes, during which time all of us became increasingly excited and amazed by what we were witnessing. We had all taken astronomy courses as part of our science curriculum, and none of us could identify any natural or conventional explanation for what we were seeing. The lights were too bright, too coordinated, and too maneuverable to be aircraft, satellites, or any known atmospheric phenomena. Around 11 p.m., the lights began to move closer to our location, descending from their original high-altitude position and approaching the mountainous area where we were camped. As they got closer, we could see that they were much larger than we had initially estimated. Each light appeared to be roughly the size of a car or small building. And they were emitting not just visible light, but also what felt like heat or energy that we could sense even at a distance. This is where my memory starts to become unclear, and where the experience took on a much more personal and disturbing character. I remember feeling an overwhelming compulsion to walk away from our campsite and move toward the area where the lights were descending. It wasn't a conscious decision. It felt more like something was pulling me in that direction, overriding my rational mind and my normal survival instincts. The next thing I clearly remember is waking up alone in a forest clearing about 3 miles from our campsite, according to the GPS readings I took later. It was 4:30 a.m., according to my watch, which meant that approximately 5.5 hours had passed since I last had clear memories of being around the campfire with my friends. I was lying on the ground in an area I didn't recognize, wearing the same clothes I'd been wearing the night before, but with no memory of how I had gotten there or what had happened during those missing hours. When I sat up and tried to orient myself, I noticed that there were strange marks on my arms. Small, circular discolorations about the size of quarters that looked like bruises but didn't hurt when I touched them. The marks were arranged in a precise pattern along my forearms, with 3 marks on each arm positioned at exactly equal distances from each other. I had no memory of receiving these marks, and there was no obvious explanation for how they might have been created. I used my compass and the sunrise to determine which direction would take me back toward our campsite, and I started hiking through the forest, calling out for my friends and hoping that they would hear me and respond. After about an hour of hiking, I finally heard voices calling my name, and I was able to reunite with the rest of the group, who had been searching for me since they discovered I was missing around 3 a.m. My friends told me that around 11:15 p.m. the previous night, I had suddenly stood up and walked away from the campfire without saying anything or responding to their questions about where I was going. They had followed me for a short distance, but I had been moving quickly and seemed to know exactly where I was headed, even though we were in unfamiliar terrain. When they lost sight of me in the darkness, they had spent several hours searching with flashlights before deciding to wait until dawn to continue looking. What was most disturbing about their account was that they reported seeing me walking toward the area where the lights had been descending, and that I had seemed to be responding to something they couldn't see or hear. Jennifer said that I had been walking with my arms outstretched, as if someone was guiding me or leading me by the hands. But there was obviously no one there with me. The strange marks on my arms were photographed and documented, but they faded completely over the following weeks, without leaving any permanent evidence of whatever had caused them. My friends also discovered that all of our electronic equipment, cameras, GPS units, cell phones, and flashlights, had been completely drained of battery power during the night, even though they had been fully charged when we went to sleep. Marcus's cameras showed no images of the lights we had photographed, despite his clear memories of taking dozens of pictures during the sighting. When we returned to campus the following week, I underwent medical examinations to determine if there might be any physical evidence of what had happened to me during those missing hours. Blood tests, neurological examinations, and psychological evaluations all came back normal, with no indication of drug use, head trauma, or mental health issues that might explain the memory loss or the strange marks on my arms. The experience has had a profound impact on my academic studies and my understanding of the natural world. While I continue to pursue my degree in environmental science, I've become much more interested in unexplained phenomena and the possibility that our current scientific understanding might be incomplete when it comes to certain aspects of reality. I've researched similar encounters and discovered that the Cumberland Gap region has a long history of UFO sightings and reports of missing time experiences, particularly in the area around Devil's Den. What troubles me most about the experience is the realization that there might be intelligences operating in these mountains that have capabilities far beyond anything we can currently understand or explain. The coordinated behavior of the lights, the precise nature of the marks that appeared on my arms, and the systematic failure of all our electronic equipment suggest contact with something that possesses advanced technology and detailed knowledge of human physiology and psychology. I've returned to Devil's Den several times since that May night in 2019, both for academic research projects and personal curiosity. But I've never experienced anything similar to that encounter. The area continues to be a site of unusual electromagnetic anomalies and occasional unexplained light phenomena, according to other researchers who have studied the region. But whatever intelligence I encountered that night has not revealed itself to me again. The experience has made me more open to the possibility that the Appalachian Mountains contain mysteries that go far beyond what conventional science can currently address. These ancient mountains have witnessed millions of years of geological and environmental changes, and perhaps they also serve as locations where different forms of intelligence occasionally intersect with human experience in ways we're not equipped to understand. My encounter in Devil's Den has convinced me that there are aspects of reality operating in these mountains that challenge our fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness, intelligence, and the physical universe. Whether what I experienced was contact with extraterrestrial visitors, interdimensional beings, or some other form of advanced intelligence, it has forever changed my perspective on the mysteries that might be hidden in the remote wilderness areas of Appalachia. My name is Robert Clearwater, and I'm 38 years old. I'm a member of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, and I live on the Qualla boundary in western North Carolina. I work as a cultural educator at the Museum of the Cherokee Indian, where I teach visitors about our traditional ways of life, our history in these mountains, and the spiritual beliefs that have guided our people for thousands of years. I also serve as a hunting guide during deer and turkey seasons, helping both Cherokee hunters and respectful non-native visitors understand the traditional practices and protocols that govern hunting in our ancestral lands. I've spent my entire life in these mountains, and I learned about their dangers and mysteries from my grandmother, who was a keeper of our old stories and traditional knowledge. But what I encountered during the winter of 2020 was something that even my grandmother's teachings had only prepared me for in theory. and it left me convinced that there are ancient hungers still prowling these mountains that pose threats far beyond what most people can imagine. I was checking some of our traditional hunting grounds in the Nantahala National Forest on February 8, 2020, during one of the coldest winters we'd experienced in years. These hunting areas have been used by Cherokee hunters for generations, and part of my responsibility as a cultural educator is to monitor them for changes that might affect their suitability for traditional hunting practices or their spiritual significance to our community. The particular area I was visiting that day is located about 8 miles south of Cherokee, in a remote section of the forest that's difficult to access during winter months because of snow and ice on the Forest Service roads. I had snowshoed about 2 miles from where I had to leave my truck, following traditional hunting trails that most non-Cherokee people don't know about because they're not marked on any official maps. These trails have been maintained by our hunters for centuries, and they follow routes through the forest that take advantage of natural deer paths, water sources, and terrain features that make them ideal for traditional hunting methods. The area I was heading to is called Enviasgaya in Cherokee, which translates roughly to Deer Place, because it's traditionally been one of the most reliable locations for finding white-tailed deer during winter months. The forest was incredibly quiet that day, with several inches of fresh snow muffling all sounds and creating the kind of pristine winter landscape that makes you feel like you're the only person for miles around. I had been walking for about an hour when I reached the main deer feeding area, a natural clearing surrounded by oak and hickory trees where deer come to forage for acorns and other food sources that remain available even during harsh winter weather. What I found in that clearing immediately told me that something was very wrong. There were deer in the area. I could see at least 6 or 7 of them scattered throughout the clearing, but their behavior was completely unnatural. Instead of feeding or moving in the alert, cautious manner that's typical for wild deer, these animals were standing perfectly still, almost like statues, all facing the same direction toward the northern edge of the clearing. They weren't showing any awareness of my presence, even though I was standing in plain sight, maybe 50 yards away from them. I watched the deer for several minutes, trying to understand what might be causing their strange behavior. They weren't frozen with fear the way deer sometimes are when they sense a predator nearby, and they weren't exhibiting the nervous energy that usually accompanies unusual weather conditions or other environmental stressors. Instead, they seemed to be in some kind of trance-like state, completely focused on whatever they were staring at in the northern part of the clearing. That's when I started to notice the tracks in the snow around the deer. At first glance, they looked like they might be human footprints, but as I examined them more closely, I realized that they were much larger than any human tracks I had ever seen. The prints were at least 18 inches long and maybe 8 inches wide, with what appeared to be 5 toe marks at the front of each print. But the stride length between the prints was enormous, at least 6 feet from one footprint to the next, indicating that whatever made these tracks was much taller and had much longer legs than any human. The tracks formed a clear pattern around the deer, circling the clearing in a wide loop that passed within 10 or 15 feet of each animal. But what was most disturbing about the track pattern was that it showed no signs of the maker having stopped to attack or chase any of the deer. Instead, the tracks suggested that something had simply walked in a large circle around the animals, as if it was studying them or perhaps performing some kind of ritual behavior that I couldn't understand. Following my grandmother's teachings about encountering signs of dangerous spiritual entities, I immediately began saying protective prayers in Cherokee and prepared tobacco offerings to show respect for whatever presence might be in the area. My grandmother had taught me that there are certain beings in these mountains that are neither fully animal nor fully spirit, and that encountering them requires specific protocols to avoid attracting their attention or arousing their hunger. As I was preparing my tobacco offering, I noticed that the deer were beginning to move. but not in the normal way that deer move when they're feeding or traveling to different locations. Instead, they were following the track pattern in the snow, walking single file along the same route that had been taken by whatever creature had made the enormous footprints. The deer moved slowly and deliberately, as if they were being guided or controlled by something I couldn't see. I watched in fascination and growing horror as the deer completed the circular route around the clearing, and then began walking toward the northern tree line, still following the mysterious tracks. They showed no awareness of my presence, and no interest in the food sources that should have been attracting them to this area. Instead, they seemed completely focused on following the path that had been laid out for them by the creature whose tracks they were following. This behavior was completely contrary to everything I knew about deer biology and natural wildlife behavior. Deer are prey animals with finely tuned survival instincts that make them extremely wary of predator scent and tracks. Under normal circumstances, finding large predator tracks in an area would cause deer to immediately flee to safer territory. But these deer were actively following the tracks, almost as if they were being compelled to do so against their natural instincts. I followed the deer and the tracks at a safe distance, maintaining my prayers and carrying my tobacco offering while trying to understand what I was witnessing. The tracks led away from the clearing and deeper into the forest, following a route that took advantage of natural corridors between the trees and avoided areas where travel would be difficult in the snow. Whoever or whatever had made these tracks possessed detailed knowledge of the terrain and was capable of moving through the forest with remarkable efficiency. After about half a mile, the tracks led to another clearing, where I found evidence that confirmed my worst fears about what I was dealing with. In the center of this second clearing, there was a large depression in the snow where something had obviously been sitting or lying down for an extended period. Around this depression, there were the remains of at least 3 deer that had been killed and partially consumed, but not in the way that any natural predator would kill and eat deer. The deer carcasses had been arranged in a specific pattern around the central depression, and they showed signs of having been killed by something with enormous strength and precision. But instead of being fully consumed the way a bear, mountain lion, or pack of coyotes would consume their prey, the deer had been killed and then apparently abandoned after only small portions had been eaten. Most of the meat remained on the bones, but certain specific parts, the heart, liver, and some of the muscle tissue from the legs, had been removed with what looked like surgical precision. This selective consumption pattern, combined with the ritualistic arrangement of the carcasses and the evidence that the deer had been led to this location rather than hunted in the traditional sense, confirmed what my grandmother's stories had taught me to recognize as signs of Wendigo activity. According to our traditional knowledge, Wendigos are cannibalistic entities that were once human, but have been transformed by their hunger into something that exists between the physical and spiritual worlds. They possess supernatural strength and the ability to influence the behavior of animals, and sometimes humans, leading their victims to places where they can be consumed. My grandmother had taught me that Wendigos are particularly active during harsh winters, when natural food sources are scarce and the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds becomes thinner. She had also warned me that Wendigos are attracted to areas where there has been violence, starvation, or other forms of extreme suffering, and that they can sense people who are emotionally vulnerable or spiritually unprotected. I immediately began the cleansing ritual that my grandmother had taught me for protection against Wendigo encounters, burning tobacco and sage, while reciting specific prayers and songs that are designed to create spiritual barriers against malevolent entities. I also marked myself with sacred symbols using clay that I carried in my medicine bag, and I placed protective offerings at the 4 cardinal directions around my position. As I was completing these rituals, I became aware that I was being watched from the forest surrounding the clearing. I couldn't see anything specific, but I had the unmistakable sensation that something large and intelligent was observing me from the shadows between the trees. The feeling was accompanied by an overwhelming sense of hunger and malevolence that seemed to emanate from whatever was watching me. A spiritual pressure that made it difficult to breathe and concentrate on my prayers. The sensation of being watched continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 or 20 minutes. During that time, I maintained my prayers and offerings while slowly backing away from the clearing, following my grandmother's instructions never to turn my back on a Wendigo or to run in a way that might trigger its hunting instincts. The presence seemed to follow me as I retreated, staying just at the edge of my perception, but never revealing itself completely. When I finally reached my truck and was able to drive away from the area, I immediately went to visit my grandmother to report what I had encountered and to seek her guidance about what actions I should take. She listened to my account with great seriousness and then told me that I had been very fortunate to encounter the Wendigo without attracting its direct attention or arousing its hunger for human flesh. According to my grandmother, the Wendigo I had encountered was probably a relatively new transformation, still primarily focused on animal prey, but potentially dangerous to humans who ventured into its territory without proper spiritual protection. She instructed me to perform additional cleansing ceremonies for several days and to avoid returning to that area of the forest until after the winter season had ended and the Wendigo had either moved to different hunting grounds or been dealt with by other means. My grandmother also asked me to report the incident to the tribal council and to our traditional healers, because Wendigo encounters are considered serious threats to the entire community that require collective spiritual response. Over the following weeks, our traditional spiritual leaders performed ceremonies designed to strengthen the barriers between our community and malevolent entities. And they conducted rituals intended to either drive the Wendigo away from our ancestral lands or to help it find peace and release from its cursed existence. I never returned to that specific area of the Nantahala National Forest, but I continued to monitor other traditional hunting grounds throughout the winter and spring of 2020. I never found evidence of similar Wendigo activity in other locations, suggesting that the entity I had encountered was either localized to that particular area or had moved on to different hunting territories after our spiritual interventions. The experience reinforced my understanding of the importance of traditional knowledge and spiritual practices in dealing with the dangers that still exist in these ancient mountains. The Appalachian Mountains have been home to human communities for thousands of years, and they've witnessed every form of human experience, including the kind of extreme suffering and spiritual corruption that can give rise to entities like Wendigos. My encounter with the Wendigo also reminded me that there are aspects of these mountains that go far beyond what modern science and conventional understanding can explain or address. The traditional knowledge that has been passed down through generations of Cherokee people includes practical guidance for dealing with spiritual dangers that most people in the modern world don't even believe exist. I continue to work as a cultural educator and hunting guide, and I always share appropriate warnings with visitors about the spiritual aspects of these mountains that they should respect and be aware of. The Wendigo I encountered in 2020 was a reminder that the old dangers are still present in these mountains, and that respecting traditional knowledge and spiritual practices isn't just about cultural preservation. It's also about survival in a landscape that contains mysteries and threats that most people can't even imagine. My name is Elizabeth Hayes, and I'm 55 years old. I work as a professional historian specializing in Civil War research and historical site preservation throughout the Mid-Atlantic region. I have a PhD in American history from George Washington University. and I've spent the past 25 years researching and documenting historical sites, particularly those related to Civil War battles, troop movements, and civilian experiences during that tumultuous period in our nation's history. My work has taken me to hundreds of historical locations throughout Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. And I'm comfortable working alone in remote areas where historical events occurred, but where modern development has been minimal. I approach my research with rigorous academic standards and a healthy skepticism toward unverified claims or sensationalized accounts. But what happened to me during a research trip to Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, on September 22, 2021, has challenged my understanding of the relationship between past and present in ways that no amount of academic training could have prepared me for. I was conducting research for a book about civilian experiences during John Brown's raid on Harpers Ferry in 1859, and the subsequent Civil War battles that occurred in and around the town throughout the 1860s. Harpers Ferry is one of the most historically significant locations in American history. Situated at the confluence of the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers and serving as a crucial transportation hub during the 19th century, the town witnessed repeated military occupations, battles, and civilian evacuations during the Civil War, and it contains numerous sites where tragic and dramatic events unfolded that shaped the course of American history. My specific research that day was focused on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Station and the role that railroad transportation played in the military strategies of both Union and Confederate forces during their various occupations of Harpers Ferry. The railroad was absolutely critical to the town's strategic importance, and control of the rail lines often determined which army could maintain their hold on the area. I was particularly interested in documenting civilian accounts of how railroad operations were affected during military occupations and battles. I had spent most of the morning in the archives at Harpers Ferry National Historical Park, reviewing primary source documents, letters, and newspaper accounts from the Civil War period. Around 2 p.m., I decided to visit the actual site of the old Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Station to take photographs and make notes about the physical layout of the area as it relates to the historical accounts I had been studying. The original station building no longer exists, but the railroad right-of-way and some of the stone foundations are still visible and provide important context for understanding how the railroad operations would have appeared during the 1860s. The day was overcast and cool, typical for late September in the Shenandoah Valley, with intermittent light rain that made the fallen leaves slippery and gave the entire area a misty, atmospheric quality that enhanced the sense of being in a place where significant historical events had occurred. I was alone at the site, which wasn't unusual since the old railroad area isn't part of the main tourist attractions that most visitors to Harpers Ferry come to see. As I was taking photographs of the stone foundations and making notes about the spatial relationships between the railroad infrastructure and the nearby buildings, I began to hear what sounded like a train whistle in the distance. At first, I assumed it was coming from one of the tourist trains that occasionally run on restored railroad lines in the region, though I wasn't aware of any active rail operations in the immediate Harpers Ferry area. The whistle sound grew louder and seemed to be approaching from the direction where the original Baltimore and Ohio line would have entered Harpers Ferry from the northeast. As the sound got closer, I began to hear what sounded like the rhythmic clacking of train wheels on railroad tracks, accompanied by the distinctive steam engine sounds that you associate with 19th-century locomotives rather than modern trains. I looked up from my note-taking and was startled to see what appeared to be a steam locomotive approaching along the old railroad right-of-way. The locomotive was clearly from the Civil War era. A small, wood-burning engine with a distinctive funnel-shaped smokestack, and the kind of elaborate decorative metalwork that characterized mid-19th century railroad equipment. Behind the locomotive was a single passenger car and what looked like a freight car, both painted in dark colors and showing the wear and weathering that you would expect from equipment that had been in regular use during wartime conditions. As the train approached the area where I was standing, I could see that there were people aboard. Both passengers visible through the windows of the passenger car and crew members working around the locomotive. The engineer was leaning out of the locomotive cab, and there was a conductor or station master standing on the platform of the passenger car, wearing the kind of uniform that railroad employees would have worn during the 1860s. What struck me most about this scene was how absolutely normal and routine it appeared. The train was moving at a moderate speed, as if it was approaching a station where it planned to stop, and the crew members were going about their duties in the matter-of-fact way that railroad workers would during any ordinary day of operations. There was nothing supernatural or ghostly about the appearance of the train or the people aboard it. It looked exactly like what you would expect to see if you had somehow been transported back to Harper's Ferry during the Civil War period. As the train drew closer to where I was standing, the conductor on the passenger car platform began waving at me and calling out in a voice that I could hear clearly despite the sound of the locomotive. He was shouting something that sounded like, "Get back from the tracks! Train coming through!" in the kind of urgent, authoritative tone that railroad employees use when they're concerned about passenger safety. I immediately stepped further away from the old railroad right-of-way, even though there were no actual tracks there and the train I was seeing couldn't possibly have been physically present. But the conductor's warning seemed so real and urgent that I responded automatically, the way you would to any legitimate safety warning from a railroad employee. As the locomotive passed the point where I was standing, the engineer leaned further out of his cab and tipped his cap to me in the polite gesture that was common among railroad workers in the 19th century when, acknowledging bystanders, I could see his face clearly, a middle-aged man with a full beard and the kind of weathered complexion that comes from years of outdoor work. He was wearing a blue work shirt and a striped railroad cap, and he looked exactly like the photographs of Civil War-era railroad engineers that I had been studying in the archives that morning. The station master or conductor, who had warned me about the approaching train, was now standing directly across from where I was positioned, separated by maybe 20 feet of space where the railroad tracks would have been during the 1860s. He was a tall, thin man, wearing a dark uniform coat with brass buttons and a peaked cap that identified him as a senior railroad employee. He appeared to be in his 40s, with graying hair and the kind of formal bearing that was characteristic of railroad officials during that period. What happened next was the most remarkable part of the entire encounter. The station master looked directly at me and spoke in clear, period-appropriate language that I could understand perfectly. He said, "Ma'am, you'll want to mind yourself around these tracks. We've had terrible accidents here, and the company won't be responsible for injuries to civilians who don't heed proper warnings." I found myself responding to him as naturally as I would to any person giving me safety instructions. I said, "Thank you for the warning. I'll be careful." He touched the brim of his cap in acknowledgement, and then walked alongside the moving train as it continued through the area, eventually climbing aboard the passenger car as the train picked up speed. I watched the entire train disappear around a bend in the old railroad right-of-way, and I could hear the sound of the whistle and the locomotive for several more minutes as it moved away from Harper's Ferry in the direction of Martinsburg. The entire encounter lasted maybe 5 or 6 minutes from the time I first heard the whistle until the train was completely out of sight and hearing. As soon as the train was gone, I immediately began documenting everything I had observed, taking detailed notes about the appearance of the locomotive, the passenger car, the crew members, and especially the specific words that the station master had spoken to me. I also took photographs of the area where the train had appeared, though I knew that the images would show only the empty right-of-way and stone foundations that exist there today. When I returned to the archives that afternoon, I began researching railroad accidents that had occurred at Harper's Ferry during the Civil War period, particularly incidents that might have involved civilian casualties and safety warnings. What I discovered was deeply unsettling and seemed to provide direct confirmation of the warning that the station master had given me. On October 17th, 1862, there had been a catastrophic train derailment at the exact location where I had encountered the phantom locomotive. A Baltimore and Ohio passenger train carrying civilian refugees fleeing from Confederate forces had derailed due to sabotage of the railroad tracks, killing 14 people and injuring dozens of others. The accident report, which I found in the B&O Railroad archives, specifically mentioned that the station master had been trying to warn people away from the tracks because of Confederate sabotage activities in the area. The most remarkable discovery was a photograph I found in the railroad company records showing the crew of the B&O trains that were operating out of Harper's Ferry during October 1862. The station master in the photograph was unmistakably the same man who had spoken to me. The same tall, thin build, the same graying hair, and the same formal uniform with brass buttons. According to the railroad records, his name was Thomas Mitchell, and he had been killed in the October 17th derailment while trying to warn passengers and bystanders about the danger to the tracks. The historical record showed that Thomas Mitchell had died attempting to prevent civilian casualties from the sabotaged railroad tracks, and that his final actions had been focused on warning people to stay away from the area where the derailment occurred. The warning he had given me about minding myself around the tracks because of terrible accidents that had happened there was essentially identical to the warnings he had been giving to civilians on the day he died in 1862. I spent several more days at Harper's Ferry researching the October 1862 derailment and the people who had been involved in the incident. What I learned convinced me that I had somehow witnessed a replay or echo of events from that tragic day, and that Thomas Mitchell was still trying to protect people from the dangers that had cost him his life over 160 years ago. The experience has profoundly affected my approach to historical research and my understanding of how traumatic events can leave lasting impressions on the locations where they occurred. Harper's Ferry witnessed enormous amounts of violence, tragedy, and human suffering during the Civil War, and perhaps some of those experiences created spiritual imprints that occasionally manifest to people who are sensitive to historical resonance. I've continued my research on Civil War railroad operations, and I've returned to Harper's Ferry several times since my encounter with Thomas Mitchell. But I've never experienced anything similar. However, I've discovered that other historians and researchers have reported similar encounters with Civil War-era figures at various locations throughout the region, suggesting that there might be something about the intensity and tragedy of that historical period that creates lasting spiritual connections between past and present. My encounter with Thomas Mitchell has convinced me that historical research involves more than just studying documents and artifacts. It also requires openness to the possibility that the people who lived through these historical events may still have messages they want to share with us. The dedication and sacrifice that Thomas Mitchell showed in trying to protect civilians during his lifetime apparently continues even after his death, and I feel honored to have been chosen as a recipient of his warning and protection. Thank you for joining me on this terrifying journey through the most haunted mountains in America. These 11 stories from the Appalachian Mountains remind us that there are still mysteries in our world that science cannot explain and experiences that challenge our understanding of reality itself. If you enjoyed these disturbing true horror stories, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Verified Fears for more authentic supernatural encounters from real people who lived through them. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads featuring the most chilling true stories from across America. Do you have your own unexplained encounter from the Appalachian Mountains or anywhere else? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience could be featured in a future episode. And if these stories have left you wanting more, check out our playlist of true horror stories from other haunted regions across the United States. Remember, the mountains are always watching, and some mysteries are better left undisturbed. Until next time, stay safe out there. Keep your eyes open for things that shouldn't exist but do.